when a young couple disappears without a trace. Their small southern town springs into action.
It was a very good relationship. Like, I've never seen any signs of anything other than, them two loving on each other.
So you're saying this odd for her behavior?
I promise you, this is very odd.
The desperate search reveals shocking secrets lurking beneath a glowing facade.
They did argue quite often about other men and him with other girls.
She said, he's saying that this may not be his baby. And I was like, what?
I kind of figured, hey, this is probably him.
The suspect bolts and runs down to the lake.
I could tell how he was looking that, it was bad.
Killer? It's been me to ask.
Everybody started crying, so I knew then something happened to her.
He stated that a dark cloud had came over him.
She had told him, the baby's here. Why are you doing this?
Even as being a prosecutor for many years, I was still shocked.
March 22nd, 2022. It's just before 9 p.m. in rural Forsyth, Georgia.
Forsyth is a small town about an hour south of Atlanta. It's a very warm and hospitable place, very family-oriented.
Like many Forsyth residents at this time of year, Willie and Latasha Proctor are at home enjoying March Madness.
And my wife was sitting, looking at a basketball game. Then her phone rang. I look down at it. I see it's Tori.
Oh, Tori's coming over.
Okay. Their 21-year-old daughter, Toriana, said she was coming over to spend the night.
Tori and her fiancé, Jadarius, had a 1-month-old baby girl at home.
From time to time, she would stay with her parents as she just adjusts to her new lifestyle.
So her parents expected Toriana and the baby home within about 30 minutes or so.
But when an hour passes with no sign of Toriana, her parents assume she changed her mind. That's when Latasha gets a call.
My phone rang. It was like 10, and I went to answer the phone.
Hey, Tori, you still coming? Phone went dead.
And then it just hung up. I was thinking her cell phone died or whatnot, so I tried to call her back, and it just kept ringing.
Still going to voicemail.
I'll try texting her.
I texted her a couple of times, didn't get no answer back. So my wife said, well, maybe when she get where she going, she probably call us back.
But another hour passes, and Toriana still hasn't shown up when Latasha receives a second call.
This time, the phone call is coming from Tori's fiance's mom.
Have you heard from Tori or Jadarius?
Jadarius' mother explains that her son dropped off their newborn baby at her home in Macon that evening, but she hasn't heard from him since.
She was like, the baby don't have any milk.
Okay, we'll be right there.
In that instant, I told my husband, we jumped up.
What's wrong?
I just had a bad feeling there, because I know Tori always prepared.
The middle child of 3 siblings, 21-year-old Toriana Proctor loved having family close by.
She was a daddy girl. Everywhere I went, she wanted to be with me. Even out when me and my son practicing football, she wanted to be right there.
Vivacious, outgoing, and smart, Toriana was known for her quick wit.
Just being around her, she's gonna crack a joke. She's gonna keep you laughing regardless of what's going on.
Her laugh was very contagious.
From a young age, Toriana was also a standout athlete.
She was great in softball. I used to have parents all the time come up to me and ask me, where did Tori get her training at? And I would tell them all the time, just me and her.
She was just that girl that took pride in herself and also wanted to bring some type of joy to anybody that she was around.
But nothing made Toriana happier than spending time with her high school sweetheart, Jadarius Quez Watts.
I grew up knowing Jadarius as well, as we like to call him, as Quez. He was very shy, but he was a very sweet person.
Honestly, it was like love at first sight with him. It was definitely like, that's my boo. And I loved it for her because I know she had a lot of love to give.
She loved herself some Jadarius. On the phone all time of night and first thing in the morning on the phone with him, you know, just that puppy love, very much so puppy love.
In the summer of 2021, Toriana and Jadarius found out they were pregnant with their baby girl.
She said, Dad, I got something to tell you. And she told me that she was pregnant, and I told her, I'm going to be there for you. Whatever you need me to do, that's what I do.
She did everything the doctor told her to do. She started preparing for it, buying this, buying that. She always wanted to be prepared for whatever came.
She was very excited, and I knew she was going to be the best mom.
With a baby on the way, the couple was ready to make one more big commitment. Later that year, Jadarius proposed.
She sent me a picture and said, I said yes. She was very happy.
That was one of the things that she always wanted, marriage, a family.
He expressed to me all the time, you know, how he felt about Tori. Trying to make sure that, you know, Tori is taken care of.
In February 2022, Toriana and Jadarius welcomed their daughter, Nalani.
Becoming parents was a huge adjustment for them, but it seemed like they were making it work and approaching things as a team.
They had big dreams. They was doing the best that they could to grow and figure love out.
But now Tori is missing, and her parents have just learned that baby Nalani was left with Jadarius' mother without any milk to drink.
We'll be right there. Come on, we gotta go.
Latasha and Willie are very concerned because they know that Tori would never do something so irresponsible. That leaves a lot of concern for her parents, so they decide to get in their car and drive 30 minutes to Macon to figure out exactly what's going on.
Thanks so much for coming. She's sleeping right now, but she'll be hungry when she wakes up.
Jadarius' mother tells the Proctors he dropped the baby off around 11 p.m.
She said he had stopped by the house for approximately 2 minutes and dropped the newborn baby off and told his mother that they were out of formula, and then he left.
He didn't give any indication of why he needed his mother to watch the baby or where he was going.
I'm talking with Jadarius' mom, and she's like, I don't know what's going on. Jadarius, he's not answering my phone call.
Tori's parents offer to take the baby back with them to Monroe County and get her some formula on the way.
Back in Forsyth, they do a drive-by by the couple's apartment.
The couple's car, a black sedan, is nowhere to be found.
We call 911 to do a wellness check and just see if they can try to get into the apartment.
Just before 2 a.m., Forsyth police officers meet the Proctors at the apartment complex.
We've been trying to get in touch with her. She had called us earlier and told us that she was on her way home. So she don't live here. Back and forth.
Tori's parents explained that the pressure of becoming new parents had been a lot for her and Jadarius.
Becoming a mom and actually birthing a child, it shifted her mindset. Like, it's not just me and what I can settle and deal with. I want the best for my child.
I didn't try to pry too much. I was like, you're more than welcome. My house is always open to any of my children.
The parents tell the police that there is no sign of the car. They also inform them that neither of them have been answering their phones.
It's just not like her. Yeah.
Can police locate the missing couple before it's too late?
So then it really just kicked in. Hey, we gotta find her. Something really wrong.
Wait, they found them?
21-year-old Toriana Proctor had just started a family with her high school sweetheart turned fiancé, Jadarius Watts, in rural Forsyth, Georgia.
She definitely wanted a kid. She wanted a few of them. She definitely wanted to be married, and I was so happy. Like, she was happy.
But now, both Toriana and Jadarius are missing. And even though it's only been a few hours, her family has connected with Forsyth police, telling them something seems dreadfully wrong.
It's just not like her.
Yeah.
Sharing their concerns, officers trek up to the second-floor apartment and knock on the door.
841 more. See if you have a 21 for this apartment.
Stand by. They knocked on the door and said, nobody answering.
So you're saying this odd for her behavior?
I promise you, this is very odd.
Me and my wife kept telling her, no, this is not like Tori. If we calling her, she calling us right back.
However, Forsyth police tell Tori's parents there's nothing more they can do for now.
They told us by the fact that Tori was an adult, that adult can be missing. They was like, she old enough to be gone if she want to.
They tell the parents that they have to wait a full 24 hours before they can do a true missing persons investigation.
And it started drizzling, raining, and we have a 1-month-old baby in the car. Like, we got to get her home, get her out this weather.
Tori's parents return home, determined to continue the search on their own.
I really felt defeated. Like, what can I do? Who can I call?
Hey, have you seen or heard from Tori today?
The Proctors start calling family and friends.
Okay, well, give me a call if you hear from her.
Her mother had like a little bit of panic in her voice saying, Tori was supposed to come home last night. She didn't come home. Have you heard from her? Is she over here with you? I'm like, So that's when I just called out the work, called my supervisor, said, hey, my friend is missing. I'm just going to go and try to help see what's going on.
I could hear my sister on the phone saying she can't find Tori. I got just like a little tightness in my chest and said a little prayer.
It started getting daybreak. I told my wife then, I said, well, maybe we need to call the sheriff department.
At the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, we don't have a timeline. If you feel that a family member is in need of help, then we're going to help right away.
At 8 a.m., Latasha calls the sheriff's office and explains that her daughter has been missing for nearly 12 hours.
Monroe County officers immediately respond to the Proctor's home to take a statement.
The Proctor family explained to me that their daughter had been missing since yesterday.
Most crimes aren't random, and with missing person cases, typically you start with the people closest to them and then work your way out. So at this point, the police decide that they need to learn everything they can about Tori and Jadarius' relationship.
Everything leading up until a couple months before the baby was born, they were okay. She talked to me. I know she wouldn't tell me everything, but she talked to me to let me, I guess to assure me that everything was okay.
However, as Toriana's due date drew nearer, she made a shocking confession.
She just cried, and she was like, Quez hit me.
After telling her parents she was on the way to their home, Toriana Proctor and her fiancé, Jadarius Watts, have been missing for nearly 12 hours.
In my mind, I was just more so of like, Lord, I know we gonna find her. She gonna be all right. But we was looking, we didn't find the car, we didn't find her, we didn't find him.
And in speaking with Toriana's parents, police are learning that her relationship with Jadarius wasn't as rosy as it looked on the outside.
She was at the end of her pregnancy. She was just crying. I'm like, Tori, what's going on? You okay? And she was like, Quez hit me.
Tori was the person like, what I say, I mean what I say. I'm serious. I stand on what I say. So an incident took place. It wasn't good, you know.
And so I was trying to talk to her. Please, Tori, talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. And she just cried and just cried and just cried.
Tori's family admits they were surprised by the recent outbursts. They'd known Jadarius for years, and until recently had never seen this angry side of him.
He seemed like, a great guy. Matter of fact, his dad and I are classmates. I knew about them as being, religious people.
Regardless, Toriana's parents encouraged her to take a stand.
So I told her, I want you to get all your stuff and come on back home. And she was like, that's what I'm going to do.
But Toriana couldn't stay away from Jadarius for long.
He called a couple days later or whatnot. They talked, they reconciled, she's back. So it was like a back and forth, back and forth. It was those instances when, he got mad, she got mad, but the next day, they're talking again, all, puppy love again.
After baby Nalani was born, the roller coaster relationship continued.
Jadarius admitted he was having a hard time with the baby. And he thought that maybe the baby wasn't his.
She said, he's saying that this may not be his baby. And I was like, what? I said, long as y'all been together.
Tori was completely heartbroken by this. She insisted she had never given him any reason to believe that she had been unfaithful to him.
This was just something that came out the blue. The whole time that they've been, dealing with each other, this never been an issue.
On March 4th, Toriana became so fed up with the accusations that she decided to take Nalani and move back in with her parents.
She had brought all her clothes home. She had brought all the baby clothes home. She was like, Mom, I'm tired. She said, I'm done.
For 2 weeks, Tori welcomed the help of her parents and the familiarity of her family home while maintaining a friendly co-parenting relationship with Jadarius.
I could tell she was happy again. She was herself again when she moved back home.
I didn't ask her too many questions because I didn't want her to feel like I was, just meddling in her business. I was happy that her and the baby were there. I knew where they was and I knew they were safe.
But just as things were calming down for Tori, she got a call from Jadarius that his mom was sick and he needed her support.
Jadarius called Tori and let her know that his mom had a stroke.
She said that Quez didn't want to be by himself. She wanted to stay, and console him.
With the baby in tow, Tori spent that night at Jadarius' mother's home in Macon.
His mother had to go to the hospital, so she just wanted to support him, so that's what she did.
The following morning, Jadarius accompanied Tori to her postpartum checkup back in Forsyth.
That next day, she said that he was taking her, to her doctor's appointment. She went to her checkup, and she called FaceTime me on the way back. She was excited, she said they released her.
The parents were really hopeful that this would be a new start for them.
But then, 6 hours later, Toriana sent the text about staying at her parents' house that night.
Oh, Tori's coming over.
Okay.
And although they didn't think much of it at the time, they're now fearing the worst.
Monroe County investigators shared the family's concerns.
The police take descriptions of the couple as well as the car and issue a BOLO.
They also get permission to start tracking Tori's cell phone.
Emergency pings can be conducted at any time when an officer feels there's an exigent circumstance to conduct one.
And in conducting the ping on Toriana's phone, the investigators immediately hit pay dirt.
It was literally 3 to 4 minutes from her house. We had to immediately, take action.
Monroe County Sheriff's deputies are trying to track down missing 21-year-old mother, Toriana Proctor. And they've just traced her cell phone to a location only 5 miles from home.
It was literally 3 to 4 minutes from her house.
It's kind of out in the county, rural area. You had cow pastures and ponds. We all started looking for that phone.
Made up of law enforcement and family, the search party strategically scans the area for any signs of what could have taken Tori off course so close to home.
I was at home with the baby, and it's heart dropping, not knowing, if she's okay, not knowing if I would see her. A lot of thoughts ran through my head.
Just calling her name out, like, Lord, don't let me find her in the woods.
Then, just before noon, officers receive a call from dispatch.
This is Lieutenant Beck.
We were able to get a ping then for Mr. Watts' cell phone and also the vehicle.
Police receive a hit that the car is about 30 minutes away at a location called Lake Juliet.
It was in the parking lot of the boat landing.
The boat ramp in Monroe County was a pretty decent little ways away from where we were at the time.
We're on the way now. We got a line on him. Let's go.
Monroe County officers race to Lake Juliet.
They're really wondering how the couple could have ended up way out there and really concerned about what they're going to find when they pull up.
When I first pulled into the boat ramp, I immediately saw a black car down toward the end of the parking lot, down toward the water.
They see a young black man sitting in the driver's seat, but it's unclear if anyone else is around.
At that point, I kind of figured, hey, this is probably him. I couldn't really see inside the car. The windows were kind of dark. The car was dark. And as I was putting my car in the park to get out to look in the car, he got out of the driver's seat and began walking to the front of his car.
Jadarius Watts! Jadarius Watts, put your hands up!
He had his hands in his pockets, and so I asked him to take his hands out of his pockets. I kind of grabbed his jacket, and I began to pat him down to make sure he didn't have any weapons on him.
Just then, another unit arrives for backup.
When I pulled up to the boat landing, they were outside of the car. They had the suspect outside speaking with them.
When Jadarius notices the other squad car, his demeanor suddenly changes from passive to panicked.
Once he saw them, he came out of his jacket, just flung around out of the jacket and took off running.
The suspect bolts and he runs to the dock, jumps in the water. We all go down to the dock. As he hits the water, he immediately turns around and asks for help because he cannot swim.
Help!
He is near drowning as the police are able to recover and pull him out of the water.
Come on, man, come on!
I got down on my hands and knees, put my right hand out, grabbed him, and picked him up and pulled him up out of the water. It's kind of like something you would see off TV, you know. When he got up out of the water, they placed him in handcuffs.
Listen, buddy. Listen. Here, roll over on your side.
We put you at notice to keep you from doing what you just did. I'll never forget, he just kept saying, hey, y'all put me down. Man, just take me out. Just put me down.
Listen to me. All this ain't necessary, okay?
You hear me? I need to know where your girlfriend is. At this point, I'm thinking, hey, he's done something. You don't run for anything.
And finally, Jadarius reveals where they can find Toriana.
She in the car, just put me down.
Monroe County Sheriff's deputies have just apprehended 22-year-old Jadarius Watts after his shocking leap into Lake Juliet.
It was just an escape route for him to try to get away from us as quick as possible.
He could not swim, so he started begging for help. They pulled him out, and we had that all on body cam.
Man, come on, you good, bro?
All right, listen.
Just calm down.
Police immediately asked Jadarius about his missing fiancée, Toriana Proctor.
I need to know where your girlfriend is. I said, where's Tori? Where's your girlfriend? Where's your girlfriend? And eventually he said she's in the back seat of the car.
She in the car, just put me down.
What's wrong with her?
Kill her? Just put me down, sir.
Did you kill her?
Just put me down.
Sir, listen, buddy, we're trying to talk to you. Come on, bro. All right, come on, let's go. At that point, I ran to the vehicle. I located Miss Proctor there under a large comforter. She was laying down across the back seat.
You could tell that she was deceased at the time.
All right, put him in your car. Get in this crime scene tape.
We kind of had all hands on deck at this point. So we taped the scene off there so they could get pictures and aerial views of that scene.
Jadarius Watts was taken into custody.
I'm just going to tell you something. You do got the right to remain silent. Anything you say could be used against you in court. I said, hey, I need to read you your rights and talk to you a little bit because you are in handcuffs. And at this point, you are under arrest.
Meanwhile, Toriana's loved ones are still at the initial search site.
I guess the hardest part was that the family was actually able to hear my radio traffic.
Anthony, we found him.
For a family desperately wanting answers, the commotion on the police radio is impossible to ignore.
Wait, they found them? They had found the black car, which, at that moment we got excited, where they at, is they okay? And then at that next moment, we heard him say, Jadarius just jumped in the water.
Wait, what's going on? I kind of got silent because I'm like, why would he jump in the water? As if, he was hiding something.
They were asking for constant updates, what's happening, what's going on. So at that point, the scene became a little more hectic.
I'm not thinking she deceased. I'm just thinking she's in the car with him. Something, maybe she's in the car hurt.
I actually called Lieutenant Thompson on the phone and I was like, hey, I need an update on her status because I knew if it was one of my family members, I would want to know as soon as possible. I got to tell the family something.
I looked at him and I could tell how he was looking that, it was bad.
Once she had been located deceased in the back of the car, I portrayed that news.
I'm so sorry they found Tori deceased.
I just, that was the worst day of my life.
Everybody started crying. And then that's when we all went back to the house to inform her mother that he killed her.
My first instinct was Nalani. Her mom is gone. It was definitely a battle because my heart is conflicted between, losing my daughter and then the person that actually took her life was in our life for so long. Never in a million years would I have thought that he would do this to my baby. Never.
Back at the lake, officers searching the car learned Jadarius may have been planning to take his own life after taking Toriana's.
They find a handwritten letter inside the vehicle.
He had written a suicide letter stating that they had both done things wrong.
He said, "I'm sorry it had to be like this, but sometimes things happen in life that shouldn't happen."
The letter made it seem like he wasn't really taking full ownership of what he'd done.
But why did he do it?
I just kind of asked him, what all had taken place and, if he was responsible for Tori's death. What'd you do to him?
That's when Jadarius makes a chilling admission. Officers with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office have just arrested 22-year-old Jadarius Watts for the murder of his 21-year-old fiancée and mother of his child, Toriana Proctor.
What'd you do to him? Can you take me to where it happened?
Yes.
Jadarius agrees to return to the scene of the crime. And on the way, he reveals more details about what happened.
They took Mr. Watts out to the scene where they had last heard Toriana's phone ping.
He told me they did argue quite often about other men and him with other girls. So there was definitely some jealousy and things of that nature going on in a relationship.
So everything happened in the car? Yes.
He told me that they were going back to Tori's house and an argument ensued. He didn't remember the road name. He just remembered he pulled off a road.
We were able to draw the conclusion that that phone call that was made just after 9 p.m., I believe personally that was her calling for help. And he snatched the phone from her, threw it into the woods.
You think you threw it over here? Where this pond is?
That's when we knew we were in the right area, and we continued the search and actually later on located the actual cell phone.
After Jadarius is taken to the sheriff's office, he changes into dry clothes and sits down to speak with homicide investigators.
You're not influencing any alcohol or drugs currently right now. If you are, you are. I mean, it's no big deal. I tried to overdose today. Feel okay now, though?
The investigators read Jadarius' rights, and at that point, he decides he's said enough.
All right. Having these rights in mind, you wish to talk to me? I'll talk to my lawyer. You want to talk to your lawyer? Okay. All right, buddy, we can't talk to you no more.
Regardless, Jadarius' previous confession permits officers to take him straight to jail.
Jadarius Watts was charged with murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and obstruction of an officer.
The following day, on what would have been Tori's 22nd birthday, her friends and family gather for a celebration of life.
The day she went missing was the day before her birthday. We actually got together on her birthday. We did a balloon release, did like a big, happy birthday, we miss you thing for her.
It's touched my heart. I know she touched a lot of people within the community. I'm always going to be grateful for my family and friends for being there with me on that day.
The loss is tough to process, but made easier by the fact that Tori's killer is behind bars.
We clearly had evidence of Mr. Watts being the person responsible.
There was really no reason for him to go to trial because he had admitted to the act and he was the only person with Toriana at the time.
However, Jadarius opts to take his chances in front of a jury.
Despite Jadarius' confession, he enters a plea of not guilty.
And on October 2nd, 2023, his trial begins in a Monroe County courtroom.
We were unclear what his defense was going to be. We thought that he may try to say that this was in the heat of the moment, which could lend him a voluntary manslaughter conviction instead of a murder conviction.
But everyone, including the prosecution, is surprised when Jadarius takes the stand.
His attorney asked what happened when he turned down Brownlee Road with Toriana and the baby, and Mr. Watts said, "I murdered her."
The guilt must have gotten to him because he completely flipped the script on his defense team and confessed to everything.
He continued to take the route that he had done what he had done and that she was not to blame for it.
Jadarius admits he had deep insecurities about his relationship with Tori.
His lawyer was asking, "Why did you do this?" "Oh, I didn't think the baby was mine. Oh, she was cheating." I'm just like, you knew the baby was yours. She did look like him.
But Jadarius couldn't let go of his suspicions, and it seemed the stress of having a baby turned his petty accusations into rage.
Their relationship appeared to be a great relationship from the outside, but pregnancy had seemed to change that for some reason. When she became pregnant with their child, he became extremely controlling and demanding on whether or not the child was his, even though he had no reason to believe that.
On the night of March 22nd, Jadarius and Toriana got into another argument about the paternity of the baby during their car ride to her parents' house.
The argument got so heated that Jadarius pulled over.
I don't think Toriana had any idea what was going to happen until the defendant turned down that road.
He stated that a dark cloud had came over him.
She realized something had gone terribly wrong, and it was at that point that she tried to call her mom for help.
Jadarius grabbed the phone from her, ending the call and hurling it into the darkness.
When Tori made an effort to get out of the car, he reached over and grabbed her, and at that point, he choked her to death.
It was hard hearing it. It was hard hearing that she had told him that, the baby's here. Why are you doing this? And it hurt me to hear that, knowing that that was my daughter's last word.
From there, Jadarius says he looked at Tori's lifeless body and panicked.
He admitted that he had gone to the apartment to get a comforter that he put over Toriana's body to conceal her body as he drove around Monroe County.
Jadarius dropped off baby Nalani at his mother's house in Macon before driving to Lake Juliet.
He just got overwhelmed, and that's when he decided to take off towards the lake.
But not before grabbing a late-night snack.
On the way from his mother's house to Lake Juliet, he actually made a quick pit stop at a Waffle House.
It's kind of shocking he even had an appetite after what he'd done.
The courtroom is stunned by the brutally honest testimony.
Even as being a prosecutor for many years, I was still shocked.
After a 2-day trial, it takes the jury less than an hour to return their verdict. Guilty on all charges.
He is sentenced to life without parole.
I wholeheartedly feel like he loved her. He still do. And I wholeheartedly feel like he's sorry. And it's just something that him and God got to work on. But I pray for him. I pray that people find forgiveness towards him.
We did get justice for her, even though that cannot bring her back or whatnot. But he would have to suffer the consequences of his actions, and that's what we wanted.
Toriana's parents have since adopted her daughter, and Nalani is now growing up surrounded by a large and loving family.
I'm happy she with us. I wouldn't want her to be no other place, but I'm also sad that my daughter don't get a chance to see the stuff that we see.
I just want to let anybody know who's watching this show.
36 years. That is how long the murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remained a wound without a name, a case filled with photographs, evidence, unanswered questions, and two families forced to live with a nightmare that refused to end. In November 1987, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg left British Columbia together, expecting what should have been an ordinary trip south into Washington state. They were young. They were a couple. They had a simple reason for traveling. They were going to Seattle to purchase equipment for Jay's family business. They crossed the border, entered the United States, and began what should have been a routine journey. Instead, they disappeared. Within days, their families were facing the horrifying reality that something had gone terribly wrong. Tanya was 18 years old. Jay was 20. They were not strangers traveling separately through an unfamiliar country. They were together, and their disappearance immediately raised the possibility that whatever had happened to both of them. But there was no immediate explanation. No phone call provided answers. No message explained where they had gone. Their families could only wait, search, and hope. Then the first terrible discovery came. On November 18th, still 1987, Tanya's body was found in a rural area near the town of Alger, Washington, about an hour north of Seattle. She had been murdered. The discovery transformed a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation, but Jay was still missing. The question became more desperate. Where was he, and what had happened to the couple? Investigators began examining everything they could find. Their vehicle became critical. The couple had traveled in a white 1977 Ford van, and after Tanya's body was found, investigators had reason to believe the van could contain evidence connecting the disappearance to the killer. The vehicle was eventually located in Bellingham, Washington. Inside were clues, but in 1987 the ability to extract and interpret forensic evidence was nowhere near what it would become. Decades later, investigators collected what they could. They documented the scene. They searched for fingerprints, biological material, and other evidence. But the most important piece of evidence would not reveal its full power for decades. The investigation soon became a desperate race against time. J.S. whereabouts remained unknown. Investigators did not know whether he was alive or dead. Tanya's death suggested that the danger had begun while they were traveling, but there was no clear explanation of who had attacked them or why. Then, on December 10th, still 1987, Jay's body was found near Monroe, Washington. He had also been murdered. The tragedy was now complete. Two young people had left home together. Both had been killed. Their families were left with grief and an investigation that seemed to have no obvious answer. The case was immediately complicated by geography. Tanya had been found near Alger. Jay was discovered near Monroe. Their van had been recovered in Bellingham. Their journey had crossed multiple locations, creating a complicated trail for investigators to reconstruct. Somewhere along that route, someone had gained control over their lives. The killer had moved through the landscape, leaving behind evidence that investigators could collect but could not yet fully understand. The question was not simply who killed Jay and Tanya. Investigators also needed to determine where the couple had encountered the killer, how he had approached them, and what had happened between their disappearance and the discovery of their body. In the years that followed, detectives pursued leads. They examined forensic evidence. They spoke with people who might have encountered the couple. But the case refused to yield a suspect. There was no confession. No eyewitness provided the decisive identification. No obvious motive explained why Jay and Tanya had been targeted. Their killer seemed to have disappeared into the enormous population surrounding the Pacific Northwest. The case gradually became what investigators call a cold case. The evidence remained. The questions remained. But the trail had gone cold. And yet, hidden inside the evidence, something extraordinary was waiting. DNA. In 1987, DNA profiling was still in its infancy. The technology was not yet the sophisticated investigative tool it would become. Biological evidence could be collected and preserved, but investigators could not simply upload a genetic profile into a national database and expect a name to appear. That limitation would become crucial. Investigators had evidence from the crime scene. They had biological material associated with the killer, but they did not have the technological ability to turn that material into an identity. The killer had effectively left behind a biological signature, but it remained anonymous. For the families, that meant years of waiting. J.S. relatives had lost a son and brother. Tanya's family had lost a daughter. The brutality of the murders was devastating enough. The uncertainty surrounding the killer made the pain even more difficult to close. There was no trial, no conviction, no explanation. The families could not look at a courtroom photograph and know that the person responsible had been held accountable. Instead, the killer remained an unknown figure. The years passed. The investigation became one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting unsolved cases. But the evidence did not disappear. It was preserved. That decision would eventually become the foundation of one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs of the modern era. Decades later, investigators would be able to return to the biological evidence using forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had not existed when Jay and Tanya were murdered. The breakthrough would demonstrate something investigators in 1987 could never have imagined. The killer's family tree could become the road leading directly to him. But before that could happen, the case would spend years trapped between what investigators knew and what they could prove. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, investigators had to reconstruct the couple's movements. Jay and Tanya had left their home in Sonic, British Columbia, and traveled south toward Washington. Their purpose was ordinary. They planned to buy equipment in Seattle for Jay's family's business. Their trip was not supposed to become a journey into darkness. Their last days would instead become a timeline detectives would examine again and again. Every location mattered. Every person who might have seen them mattered. Every piece of physical evidence mattered. But the most disturbing possibility was that the killer had encountered them during their travels and somehow gained access to them. Investigators needed to understand whether Jay and Tanya had been approached by a stranger, whether they had stopped somewhere voluntarily, and how their vehicle had ultimately ended up in Bellingham. The van became a crucial part of the investigation because it could potentially contain traces of the person who had entered it. Investigators recovered evidence from the vehicle, and biological material would later become central to identifying the killer. But in 1987, the evidence could not speak clearly enough. Technology could tell investigators that a biological sample existed. It could not yet tell them the name attached to it. This is what made the case so frustrating. The killer had not left without leaving anything behind. He had left evidence. The problem was that the evidence was decades ahead of the technology needed to exploit it. The investigation continued through the late 1980s and into the following decades. Detectives revisited leads. Advances in forensic science allowed older evidence to be examined in new ways. DNA testing eventually produced a profile from biological evidence associated with the crime. That profile was significant because it could potentially identify the person responsible if investigators ever obtained a matching sample. But traditional searches did not produce the breakthrough they needed. The unknown profile remained unknown. The case, therefore, entered a strange state. Investigators knew more than they had known in 1987, but not enough to name the killer. They had a genetic profile. They had crime scene evidence. They had the histories of Jay and Tanya. They had the timeline of their journey. They had 2 murdered young people and a killer who had somehow remained invisible. But they still lacked the one thing that could transform all of that information into an arrest: an identity. Then forensic genealogy began changing the landscape of cold case investigations across the United States. Instead of searching only criminal databases, investigators could use genetic relationships found through genealogy databases to locate relatives of an unknown suspect. A distant relative could become the first branch of a family tree. That branch could lead to another. Eventually, investigators could identify a person whose age, location, and circumstances matched the crime. It was a revolutionary concept because it meant a killer did not necessarily need to have been arrested previously to become identifiable. Through DNA, his relatives could unknowingly provide the path. In the case of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Keelenborg, that new science would eventually become the key. But first, investigators had to revisit evidence that had been collected 30 years earlier. They had to take biological material from a crime committed in 1987 and apply technology developed decades later. The old case suddenly became a modern forensic investigation. The killer had spent more than 3 decades believing, perhaps, that the past was buried. But the evidence had not forgotten. The DNA had not forgotten, and the passage of time, which had once seemed to protect the unknown perpetrator, was about to become part of the investigation itself. Because every generation added new technology, new databases, and new methods of analysis. The same evidence that had once produced nothing more than an unidentified profile could now point toward relatives the investigators had never known existed. The case was no longer limited to the question of who had been present in Washington in November 1987. Investigators could begin asking a different question: whose family carried the genetic signature left behind at the crime scene? That question would eventually lead them toward a name. But before that name emerged, the families of Jay and Tanya had to endure something that no technology could repair. Decades without justice. Decades in which anniversaries came and went. Decades in which the faces of 2 young people remained frozen in photographs while the world around them changed. Decades in which their killer remained unidentified. And through all those years, the case remained open, waiting for the moment when science would finally catch up with the evidence. The breakthrough would not come from a dramatic confession or a forgotten eyewitness suddenly appearing at a police station. It would come from something far smaller, something invisible to the naked eye, something left behind in 1987, a genetic trace. A fragment of biological evidence, a silent signature that had waited more than 30 years for someone to understand what it meant. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kalenborg entered a new and painful phase after both victims were found, because investigators now knew that 2 young people had been killed, but they still did not know why, where exactly the killer had first encountered them, or who had been responsible. The evidence was scattered across Washington state, and every location seemed to raise another question. Tanya's body had been discovered near Alger on November 18th, Sill, 1987. Jay's body was found near Monroe on December 10th. Their van had been recovered in Bellingham. The couple had traveled from British Columbia into Washington for what was supposed to be a short business trip, and their families had expected them to return home. Instead, the journey became a murder investigation that would remain open for more than 3 decades. Detectives worked to reconstruct their movements and understand how their lives had intersected with the person who killed them. At the time, investigators had no obvious suspect. There was no known relationship between the victims and their killer that could immediately explain the crime. The absence of a clear motive made the investigation even more difficult. Jay and Tanya had not simply disappeared under mysterious circumstances. They had been separated, attacked, and killed, and their bodies had been left in different locations. The person responsible had managed to move through the area without being identified. Yet the killer had made one critical mistake. He had left behind biological evidence. That evidence would eventually become the most important witness in the entire case. In 1987, however, forensic DNA analysis was still developing. Investigators could collect biological material, but the technology was nowhere near the level it would reach decades later. There was no modern forensic genetic genealogy system waiting to compare an unknown profile against millions of potential relatives. There was no simple digital search that could turn a biological sample into a person's name. The evidence had to be preserved, and investigators had to hope that science would eventually become capable of doing what the technology of the day could not. As the years passed, the case became cold. Detectives followed leads and examined possible suspects, but none produced the breakthrough needed to identify the murderer. Meanwhile, the families of Jay and Tanya continued living with the consequences. They knew what had happened to their loved ones, but they did not know who had done it. That distinction mattered. A homicide without an identified offender leaves a family suspended between grief and uncertainty. There is no final courtroom moment, no sentence, no official explanation of what happened. The victims remain permanently connected to an unanswered question. For J.S. family, the memory of a 20-year-old man who had left home with his girlfriend was forever tied to the knowledge that someone had taken his life. For Tanya's family, the same was true of an 18-year-old woman whose future had been taken away. And for investigators, the case remained a file that could not be forgotten because the evidence still existed. The biological evidence eventually produced a DNA profile associated with the unknown offender. That was an enormous step forward compared with the earliest days of the investigation because investigators now had a genetic identifier. But a profile without a name was still a dead end. Traditional law enforcement databases did not provide the match investigators needed. The unknown man had apparently not left his DNA in a way that created a direct comparison in those systems. The profile could tell investigators that the same biological source was connected to the crime, but it could not tell them where that person lived, who his relatives were, or what his name was. The case remained frozen. Then the world of forensic investigation began changing. Genetic genealogy had already begun demonstrating its potential in identifying perpetrators from old cases, particularly when investigators possessed a reliable DNA profile but no direct database match. The principle was both simple and revolutionary. A person might never have submitted his own DNA to a law enforcement database, but one of his relatives might have uploaded genetic information to a public genealogy service for family history research. That relative might be completely innocent and completely unaware that the information could someday help investigators identify a distant family member. But genetically, the relationship could provide a pathway. Investigators could identify relatives, construct family trees, and narrow the possibilities until one individual remained. The technique had limitations and required careful verification, but it created an investigative avenue that had not existed when Jay and Tanya were murdered. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office eventually turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that had been developing forensic genetic genealogy techniques for law enforcement. Investigators provided the unknown DNA profile for analysis. The work did not instantly produce the killer's name. Instead, genetic genealogists searched for relatives connected to the profile and began building a family tree. What they found was extraordinary. The unknown killer appeared to be connected to a family in Washington. The investigators now had something they had never possessed before, a genetic roadmap. But a roadmap is not the same as a destination. A distant relative could point investigators toward an entire network of people. The task was to determine which individual within that network could have committed the murders in 1987. Genealogists traced relationships backward and forward through generations. They examined birth records, marriage records, family connections, and locations. The goal was to narrow the family tree to people who could plausibly fit the evidence. The investigation gradually focused on a man named William Earl Talbot. Talbot lived in Washington. He had been born in 1967, making him 20 years old at the time of the murders. His age was significant because it placed him within the appropriate range, but a genealogical lead alone could never be enough. Investigators needed to determine whether Talbot's DNA actually matched the biological evidence connected to the crime. They needed a sample from him. That presented another challenge because Talbot was not simply going to walk into a police station and voluntarily provide DNA to confirm whether he was connected to a 30-year-old double murder. Investigators therefore had to obtain DNA through an investigative method that could be tested against the existing crime scene profile. In March 2018, detectives followed Talbot in Snohomish County and collected a discarded cup from him after he had finished drinking from it. The item was sent for DNA testing. The result was the moment investigators had been waiting for. The DNA from the discarded cup matched the DNA profile developed from biological evidence associated with the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. After more than 30 years, the unknown killer had a name: William Earl Talbot. The breakthrough was stunning because the suspect had not been identified through an eyewitness, a confession, or a conventional database match. He had been identified through a combination of old forensic evidence, modern genetic genealogy, and investigative persistence. The DNA had been there since 1987. What had changed was the ability to interpret it. Investigators now had reason to believe they had finally found the man responsible for the murders. But the case was not finished. The DNA match was powerful, yet prosecutors still needed to build a complete case. They had to establish the connection between Talbot and the crime and present evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. The genetic genealogy had produced an investigative lead. The discarded cup had provided the direct DNA comparison. Now the legal system would have to determine what the evidence meant. For the families, the news was overwhelming. More than 30 years of uncertainty had suddenly been replaced by an arrest. Talbot was taken into custody in 2018 and charged in connection with the murder. The cold case had exploded back into the headline. A crime that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved was suddenly moving toward a courtroom. But the revelation created another shock. Investigators discovered that the suspect had lived in the same region for decades. The killer had not been hiding in some distant country. He had been living an ordinary life while the investigation remained open. That reality made the passage of time feel even more disturbing. For 30 years, the families had wondered whether the killer was dead, whether he had fled, whether he was watching the investigation from a distance, or whether he was simply living among people who had no idea what he had done. Now there was an answer. He had been there. The technology had finally caught up with him. Yet even before the trial began, investigators faced the same challenge that had haunted the case from its first days: reconstructing what happened during the journey that had begun in British Columbia and ended in murder. DNA could connect Talbot to biological evidence, but the family still needed to understand how Jay and Tanya had encountered him. Investigators needed to establish the circumstances surrounding the killing, and prosecutors needed to present a coherent case showing the jury not only that Talbot's DNA was connected to the crime, but that he was responsible for the deaths. The evidence would soon be tested in court, but before that happened, the genetic breakthrough itself had already changed the history of the case. The unknown man who had haunted the investigation for 30 years was no longer unknown. His identity had emerged from a family tree built from DNA. A discarded cup had provided the confirmation, and a cold case that had seemed almost untouchable was suddenly alive again, with detectives standing at the door of a courtroom and a suspect finally facing the consequences of a crime that had begun more than 3 decades earlier. The arrest of William Earl Talbot in 2018 transformed the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation from a decades-old mystery into an active prosecution almost overnight. But the DNA breakthrough was only the beginning of the legal battle. For 30 years, investigators had possessed a biological profile without a name. Now they had a name, a living suspect, and a forensic connection that could be placed before a jury. The question had changed. It was no longer simply who left this DNA behind. It was, what exactly does that DNA prove, and can the evidence establish beyond a reasonable doubt that William Earl Talbot was responsible for the deaths of Jay and Tanya? That distinction would become central to everything that followed. Talbot was arrested in May 2018 after investigators used genetic genealogy to identify him as a possible suspect, and then obtained a discarded drinking cup containing his DNA. The comparison reportedly produced a match to biological evidence recovered during the original investigation. The breakthrough was remarkable because it demonstrated the power of combining old evidence with modern science. But a DNA match does not exist in isolation. Prosecutors had to place it inside the chronology of the crime. They had to show how the evidence connected Talbot to the victims and how the circumstances surrounding the murders fit together. And they had to confront the fact that more than 3 decades had passed. Memories had faded. Evidence had been preserved, but the world surrounding that evidence had changed. People who might have remembered the victims in 1987 were now decades older. Places had changed. Records had to be located and interpreted. Yet the case had something investigators in 1987 could only have dreamed about: a genetic link that pointed toward a specific person. Talbot had been 20 years old when Jay and Tanya were killed. He lived in the area, and according to the prosecution, the DNA evidence connected him directly to biological material associated with Tanya. Investigators also developed evidence concerning the couple's movements and the locations where their bodies were discovered. The prosecution's theory was that Talbot encountered the couple after they entered Washington and that he became involved in the events leading to their death. The defense, however, challenged the interpretation of the evidence and questioned how the genetic genealogy process had been used to identify Talbot. This was an important point because because forensic genetic genealogy is an investigative technique, not itself a substitute for traditional proof at trial. The genealogy process can identify a possible suspect, but investigators still need independent evidence connecting that suspect to the crime. In this case, the discarded cup became crucial because it allowed detectives to compare Talbot's DNA directly with the profile from the crime scene. That confirmation transformed the genealogical lead into a conventional forensic connection. The case now contained two distinct stages of identification. Genealogy had pointed investigators toward Talbot, and DNA testing had provided the direct comparison. But the courtroom would not simply hear the words DNA match and stop there. Jurors would have to understand how the evidence had been obtained, what it meant, and how it fit with everything else. The prosecution presented the genetic evidence as a powerful link between Talbot and the crime. The defense sought to raise questions about the reliability and interpretation of that evidence, as well as other aspects of the investigation. Meanwhile, the families of Jay and Tanya were watching a case they had almost certainly feared never reached this stage. For them, the arrest represented a dramatic shift after 30 years of waiting. The unknown killer was finally a person standing before the justice system. Yet even then, the families knew that an arrest was not a conviction. They had already lived through decades of uncertainty. They now had to wait again, this time for the courts. The first major trial concerned the murder of Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Prosecutors presented evidence intended to show that Talbot was responsible for her death. The biological evidence was central, but investigators also relied on other information gathered during the renewed investigation. The prosecution argued that the DNA evidence did not merely place Talbot somewhere in the general vicinity. It connected him to evidence associated with the crime. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation and sought to create reasonable doubt. But the genetic evidence proved extraordinarily difficult to overcome. After deliberation, the jury found Talbot guilty of first-degree murder in Tanya's death. The verdict marked an extraordinary moment in the history of the case. 31 years after Tanya had been murdered, the person prosecutors identified as responsible had finally been convicted. But the case did not end there. Jay Cook had also been murdered, and prosecutors still had to pursue the separate charge connected to his death. The second phase would bring the same central question back into focus. Could the evidence establish Talbot's responsibility for J.S. murder as well? The two victims had been together when they traveled south. Their deaths were connected by the same journey and the same investigation. Yet the legal system had to consider each homicide independently. Evidence connecting Talbot to one victim did not automatically prove every element of the second murder. Prosecutors, therefore, had to present the case carefully. The evidence from Tanya's murder and the evidence from J.S. murder had to be understood within the larger chronology. The prosecution argued that Talbot was the person responsible for both deaths. The defense continued to challenge the case. But again, the genetic evidence remained central. The same forensic breakthrough that had shattered the 30-year-old mystery was now becoming the foundation of a courtroom prosecution. The significance of that moment extended far beyond this particular case. Before genetic genealogy, investigators faced a recurring problem in cold cases. What happens when a crime scene contains a DNA profile, but the person behind it has never entered a searchable criminal database? Traditional DNA comparison can only produce a match when there is something to compare against. Genetic genealogy created a different path. It could identify relatives rather than the suspect himself, allowing investigators to construct a family tree and narrow possibilities. That is essentially what happened here. A biological trace from 1987 eventually led investigators through a network of genetic relationships toward Talbot. The case became one of the most prominent examples of forensic genetic genealogy being used to solve a decades-old homicide. But the method also generated important questions about privacy, consent, and the use of consumer genetic databases in criminal investigation. People who submit DNA to genealogy services may do so for family history purposes, not because they expect their genetic information to become part of a police investigation. In the years after the Talbot arrest, those questions would become part of a broader national debate. But for the families of Jay and Tanya, the immediate concern was much more personal. They wanted the case resolved. They wanted the person responsible held accountable. and they wanted the years of uncertainty to finally have an endpoint. The first conviction brought a measure of that closure, but not everything was finished. Talbot still faced the prosecution related to J.S. death. The courtroom would again revisit the evidence from 1987, forcing jurors to look backward more than 3 decades. They would hear about the young couple who had traveled south from British Columbia. They would hear about their disappearance. They would hear about the discovery of Tanya's body. They would hear about Jay's body being found weeks later, and they would hear about biological evidence that had survived from the original investigation. Every piece had to be placed into a coherent story. The prosecution's challenge was to turn fragments accumulated over 30 years into a narrative that a jury could understand. The defense's challenge was to convince jurors that the prosecution had not established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It was no longer 1987. The investigation had been transformed by technology, but the basic questions remained the same. Who encountered Jay and Tanya? What happened to them? And who was responsible? The difference was that investigators now had a suspect whose DNA could be compared against evidence collected at the time of the murder. That comparison was the breakthrough that changed everything. Without it, the case might have remained another unsolved file. With it, the case had moved into court. The story of Jay and Tanya was no longer being told only through old police reports and family memories. It was being presented as evidence in a murder prosecution. The passage of time itself became part of the story. 30 years had passed, but the biological evidence had survived. The victims could no longer speak. The killer had apparently believed the case would remain unsolved, but the evidence had remained capable of telling investigators where to look. As the second prosecution approached its conclusion, the emotional weight of the case became impossible to ignore. 2 young people had left home together in 1987. Their families had spent decades without knowing who was responsible. Then, through a technology that had not existed when they were killed, investigators had traced an unknown DNA profile through a family tree and arrived at a living suspect. A discarded cup had provided the final genetic confirmation. An arrest had followed. A conviction had followed that, and now the justice system was preparing to decide the final piece of the case. The question was no longer whether the cold case could be reopened. It had been reopened. It was no longer whether the killer could be identified. Investigators believed they had identified him. It was no longer whether DNA could reach backward across 30 years. It had already done so. The question was whether the courtroom would accept the evidence and deliver the final judgment on the second murder. For the families, another verdict was approaching. For investigators, decades of work were approaching a conclusion. And for the case itself, the moment had arrived when a crime committed in 1987 would finally be judged in a courtroom more than 30 years later, with forensic science at the center of the prosecution and the truth about 2 young lives hanging on the evidence that had survived all those years. The second murder trial brought the case back to the beginning, back to the winter of 1987, when Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had crossed the border into Washington and disappeared. But this time, the investigators were no longer searching blindly through an ocean of possibilities. They had a suspect. They had DNA. They had a prosecution built on evidence that had survived for more than 3 decades. And they had 2 families waiting for the justice that had been delayed for so long. The first conviction for Tanya's murder had already demonstrated that the genetic evidence could survive courtroom scrutiny. Now prosecutors had to prove that William Earl Talbot was also responsible for J.S. death. The 2 murders were connected by the same journey, the same disappearance, and the same investigation, but the court still had to consider the evidence relating to Jay independently. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the biological evidence and on the reconstruction of events surrounding the couple's final days. Talbot had been 20 years old in 1987, roughly the same age as the victims. He lived in the region where the murders occurred. The DNA evidence connected him to biological material recovered during the original investigation. The question for jurors was whether the totality of that evidence established his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense continued to challenge the prosecution's case, but the problem facing the defense was the same one that had made the cold case breakthrough possible in the first place. The biological evidence was not dependent on a witness remembering something from 30 years earlier. It had survived. It had been tested. It could be compared, and its significance had been reinforced by the direct DNA sample investigators obtained from Talbot. The discarded cup became one of the most memorable details of the investigation because it represented the moment when modern forensic science turned a genealogical lead into a direct identification. Detectives had followed Talbot, recovered the discarded item, and submitted it for testing. The DNA profile matched the biological evidence connected to the murders. The technique was simple in appearance, but extraordinary in consequence. A cup thrown away after an ordinary moment in 2018 became the link to a murder investigation that began in 1987. More than 30 years separated the two pieces of evidence, yet genetics connected them. That connection helped investigators overcome one of the greatest obstacles in cold case investigations: the absence of a living trail. The killer had not needed to confess. He had not needed to leave a new piece of evidence at a recent crime scene. He had simply needed to live long enough for investigators to find him, and science did the rest. During the prosecution, jurors were exposed to the history of the case and to the consequences of the murder. Jay and Tanya had traveled south together from British Columbia. They were young and had planned a routine trip to Seattle. Instead, both were killed. Tanya's body was discovered in November. Jay's body was discovered in December. Their families spent decades without a definitive answer. The investigation had gone through periods of intense activity and long stretches of silence. The original evidence had been preserved, but the identity of the offender remained hidden. Then the development of forensic genetic genealogy created a new opportunity. Investigators did not simply search for a name. They searched for relatives. That process eventually led to Talbot. His identification was not a matter of guessing. It was based on genetic relationships that narrowed the field and led investigators to a specific individual. The direct DNA comparison then provided the crucial confirmation in court. That scientific chain became part of the prosecution's argument. The case was no longer an abstract cold case mystery. It was a forensic investigation with a named defendant. The defense had to confront the implications of the DNA evidence while also challenging the way investigators had interpreted the broader circumstances. But jurors ultimately found Talbot guilty of Jay's murder as well. The verdict meant that both killings had finally resulted in convictions. For the families, the significance was enormous. Jay and Tanya had not simply become another unsolved case filed away in an archive. Their names had remained attached to an investigation that continued across generations, and the eventual convictions represented the conclusion that their families had waited decades to see. Yet the verdict also raised a larger question. How had a case that seemed impossible to solve suddenly become solvable? The answer lay in the evolution of forensic science. In 1987, investigators could not have anticipated the power that genetic genealogy would eventually possess. They collected evidence using the technology available to them. Some of that evidence produced limited results. As DNA profiling developed, investigators were able to generate a genetic profile from evidence associated with the crime. But without a database match, that profile could only sit in the background. It identified the biological source as an unknown person. Genetic genealogy changed the investigative logic. Instead of asking whether the killer himself was already in a database, investigators could ask whether any of his relatives were. That difference was decisive. A distant relative might share enough genetic information to reveal a family connection. Genealogists could then construct family trees and identify possible candidates. The process could take investigators from an unknown profile to an entire family network, and from that network to a particular individual. In the Cook Van Cuylenborg case, that individual was Talbot. The breakthrough became one of the most closely watched examples of forensic genetic genealogy in the United States. It demonstrated that old evidence could become newly useful when technology changed, but it also raised questions about the boundaries of law enforcement's access to genetic information. Consumer DNA databases had been created largely for people interested in discovering ancestry and family relationships. Many users had never imagined that their genetic data could indirectly assist police in identifying a distant relative suspected of murder. The ethical debate became part of the larger story surrounding genetic genealogy. Supporters argued that solving violent crimes and identifying killers could justify the investigative use of such information. Critics raised concerns about privacy, consent, and the possibility that people who had never committed crimes could become involved in investigations because of their genetic relationship. Those debates would continue long after Talbot's conviction, but for the families of Jay and Tanya, the immediate issue was not the future of genetic privacy. It was the past. They had waited more than 30 years for the name of the person responsible. Now they had it. The courtroom proceedings also gave the case something it had lacked for decades, a public reconstruction. The evidence could finally be presented in a setting where each side had the opportunity to challenge it. Witnesses could testify. Experts could explain DNA. Prosecutors could describe the investigation. Defense attorneys could question the state's conclusions. The case was no longer a mystery existing only inside police files. It had become a matter of public record, and that mattered because the families had lived with uncertainty for so long. A cold case can become part of a family's identity. Every anniversary can bring back the original grief. Every new investigative development can reopen hope and fear. Every false lead can create another disappointment. When an arrest finally comes, there is often a strange mixture of emotions: relief because the mystery has a direction, anger because the answer took so long, grief because the person who was killed cannot return, and anxiety because a conviction is not guaranteed. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg families had experienced all of those emotions. The arrest in 2018 brought the case back into national attention. The trials brought even more scrutiny, and the convictions finally established legal accountability. But the passage of time meant that some questions could never be answered with complete certainty. Talbot could be convicted based on evidence presented in court, but the full emotional story of Jay and Tanya's final hours could never be restored. Their families could never recover the lost decades. Jay would never grow beyond 20. Tanya would never grow beyond 18. Their photographs remained images of young people who had no chance to become older versions of themselves. That is the cruel mathematics of murder. Time moves forward for everyone except the victim. The world changes. Families grow older. Technology evolves. Cities expand. People move away. But the victim remains forever at the age when life was taken. For 36 years, the investigation moved forward while Jay and Tanya remained fixed in 1987. The eventual convictions created a legal conclusion, but they could not change that reality. What they could change was the status of the case. The unknown killer was no longer unknown. The families no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would ever be found. The investigators who had inherited the case decades later had succeeded where previous generations could not. The evidence that had once appeared insufficient had become decisive, and the forensic method that had not existed in 1987 had transformed a genetic profile into a suspect. The case, therefore, became a landmark in modern cold case investigation. It showed what could happen when old evidence was preserved and new science was applied. It also showed why a case should never necessarily be considered hopeless. Simply because conventional investigative methods have failed, the evidence may still be waiting. The breakthrough may not exist yet. The technology may not have been invented. A genetic profile can remain unidentified for decades and then suddenly become the key to an entire family tree. In this case, that family tree led investigators to William Earl Talbot. His arrest ended the uncertainty surrounding the identity of the killer. His convictions ended the criminal prosecution. But the story of Jay and Tanya did not end in the courtroom. Their murders remained a warning about how vulnerable ordinary journeys can become, how devastating an unsolved crime can be for families, and how dramatically technology can alter an investigation decades after the original evidence was collected. The most extraordinary part was that the breakthrough did not come from a newly discovered witness or a hidden confession. It came from DNA that had been waiting since 1987. The killer had left something behind, something invisible, something that investigators could preserve but not fully exploit. 30 years later, science finally found a way to read it, and once it did, the entire case moved with startling speed. A genetic genealogy search produced a family connection. Investigators identified a suspect. A discarded cup produced a direct DNA match. An arrest followed. Trials followed. Convictions followed. The cold case that had once seemed almost untouchable was finally brought into the courtroom. Yet beneath all the science and legal arguments remained the simplest and most devastating truth. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had left British Columbia together expecting to return home. They never did. Their families waited more than 30 years for answers. And when those answers finally arrived, they came through a technology that could identify the man responsible, but could never return the years that had been taken from the people who loved them. 36 years after two young people began an ordinary journey south, the case had reached its legal conclusion. But the impact of what happened in 1987 would continue long after the courtroom doors closed, because the investigation had become something larger than a single murder case. It had become proof that evidence can survive time, that science can reopen doors that appear permanently closed, and that sometimes the smallest trace left behind at a crime scene can wait for decades before revealing the name of the person who left it there. The convictions brought a legal ending to a case that had resisted resolution for more than 3 decades. But the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg did not become less disturbing simply because a jury had finally delivered its verdict. If anything, the conclusion forced investigators, families, and the public to look backward and examine how a crime committed in 1987 could remain unsolved until modern genetic science transformed a decades-old biological trace into the identity of a living man. For the families, the central question had never been technology. It had always been the same unbearable question. Who killed Jay and Tanya, and why did it take so long to find him? The answer to the first question eventually came through DNA. The second question was much harder. Even after William Earl Talbot was convicted, the complete story of what happened during those final days could not be recovered. The passage of time had destroyed some possibilities forever. People who might once have remembered details had grown older. Places had changed. Memories had faded. And the two people who could have provided the clearest account of their final hours were dead. That is, one of the most painful realities of a cold case. Solving a murder does not necessarily mean recovering every lost detail. Sometimes investigators can establish responsibility without being able to reconstruct every moment. In the Cook Van Cuylenborg case, the scientific evidence was powerful enough to identify the killer, but science could not restore the victim's voice. Jay and Tanya had been young people with plans, families, and ordinary expectations. Their trip south was supposed to be temporary. Instead, it became the final journey of their lives. When their bodies were discovered, investigators were confronted with 2 separate crime scenes and a mystery that stretched across Washington state. Tanya was found near Alger. Jay was found near Monroe. Their van was recovered in Bellingham. The geographic separation created an investigation that required detectives to piece together a chain of events rather than focus on a single location. The killer had moved through the region, and every movement potentially represented another piece of the puzzle. The original investigators did what they could with the tools available. They collected evidence. They interviewed people. They investigated leads. They attempted to understand the couple's movement. But without a suspect, the investigation gradually lost momentum. This was not because the victims were forgotten. Their families never forgot them. It was because a cold case can reach a point where every conventional path has been exhausted. Investigators can only pursue the information available to them. If no witness can identify the offender and no database produces a match, the case can remain open but inactive. That was the position of the Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation for years. The biological evidence remained one of the few elements capable of changing that situation. DNA testing eventually generated a profile associated with the unknown offender, but the profile was effectively anonymous. It told investigators that they had biological evidence from the person they were searching for, but it did not tell them the person's name. That distinction is critical. DNA can be extraordinarily precise when investigators have a reference sample for comparison, but without a reference, a genetic profile can remain simply an unknown sequence. The technology can describe the person biologically without identifying him personally. For decades, that was the problem. Investigators had the signature but not the owner. Then forensic genetic genealogy changed the rules. Instead of requiring the killer's own DNA to appear in a criminal database, investigators could search for relatives. The genetic profile could reveal family connections that conventional law enforcement searches would never detect. Once those connections were identified, genealogists could construct family trees and narrow the possibilities. The process that eventually led to Talbot was painstaking. It required expertise in genetics and genealogy and careful investigative verification. The first genetic relationship did not simply produce a suspect. It produced a network. Investigators had to work through that network and determine which person could plausibly have been responsible. Talbot eventually emerged as the key candidate. He was 20 years old in 1987. He lived in Washington. The circumstances fit, but investigators still needed direct evidence. That came through the discarded cup. Detectives obtained the cup after following Talbot and recovered his DNA from it. Laboratory testing produced the match investigators needed. The unknown DNA from the old case corresponded with Talbot's genetic profile. The cold case had finally become an active criminal investigation. His arrest in 2018 was a moment that would have seemed almost impossible only a few years earlier. The families had waited so long that an arrest could feel unreal. The killer was no longer a faceless, unknown person somewhere in the world. He was a named individual. He was alive. He could be brought into court. The investigation had crossed a line that had seemed unreachable, but the arrest also reopened the pain of the original crime. Families who had spent decades learning to live with uncertainty suddenly had to revisit the details of the murder. Old photographs resurfaced. Memories returned. The media began reporting on the case again. Investigators and prosecutors examined evidence collected more than 30 years earlier. The victims' names were once again appearing in headlines. For some families, solving a cold case can create a strange emotional contradiction. They want the case solved desperately, yet the process of solving it forces them to relive the worst period of their lives. Every new fact can reopen grief. Every courtroom appearance can bring the past into the present. Every photograph of the defendant can remind them that the person accused of killing their loved one had been living somewhere in the world while they were trying to rebuild their lives. That emotional burden was part of the Cook Van Cuylenborg story. The legal process eventually produced convictions, but it could not erase the decades of uncertainty that came before them. The case also became important for another reason. It demonstrated the potential of forensic genetic genealogy to change how law enforcement approached unsolved murder. Before that technique became widely known, investigators often faced a binary problem. Either the DNA profile matched someone already known to law enforcement, or it did not. If it did not, the case could remain frozen. Genetic genealogy introduced another possibility. The unknown profile could be compared against genealogical data to find relatives, creating a bridge between the crime scene and a family tree. The implications were enormous. A person did not need to have been arrested previously. He did not need to have voluntarily provided DNA to police. He did not need to appear in a conventional database. A relative's genetic information could potentially lead investigators toward him. That was precisely what made the Cook Van Cuylenborg case so significant. The investigation demonstrated that an offender could remain unidentified for decades and still be located through evidence left behind at the original crime scene. But the same technique also raised difficult ethical questions. Genealogy databases contain information belonging not only to the person who submitted the DNA, but also indirectly to relatives who may never have agreed to participate in law enforcement investigations. A person can share genetic connections with hundreds of relatives. If investigators use one person's genetic data to identify another, the consequences extend beyond the original database user. The debate over privacy became increasingly important as genetic genealogy was used in more cold cases. Supporters argued that violent crimes should not remain unsolved when technology can identify perpetrators. Critics questioned whether consumers fully understand how their genetic information may be used and whether law enforcement should have access to such databases without stricter limits. The Cook Van Cuylenborg case therefore became part of a much larger conversation about the future of criminal investigation. Yet behind those debates were two families who had no interest in abstract arguments about technology. They wanted their loved ones remembered as people, not simply as the names of victims in a famous forensic case. Jay was 20 years old. Tanya was 18. They had plans. They had relationships. They had families waiting for them to return. Their lives were more than the circumstances of their deaths. The passage of 36 years can sometimes create a dangerous distance from the victims. A cold case becomes a file becomes a headline becomes a statistic. But Jay and Tanya were not statistics. They were two young people who expected to continue living. The investigation's eventual success mattered because it restored their names to the center of the story. Their killer's identification was important, but the reason investigators kept working was the same reason their families never stopped caring. Jay and Tanya deserved answers. The verdicts could not bring them back, but they could establish responsibility. They could formally state that the person convicted in court was responsible for their deaths. They could replace decades of uncertainty with a legal conclusion. They could also correct the historical record. For years, the case had existed as an unsolved double murder. After the convictions, it became a case study in how modern forensic technology can revisit old evidence and produce new answers. That transformation was not instantaneous. It depended on evidence preservation. If the biological material had been lost or contaminated, modern technology could have offered nothing. If investigators had never revisited the case, the genetic profile might have remained unidentified. If genetic genealogy had not developed, the unknown profile might never have been connected to a family. If detectives had not pursued the genealogical lead, there might have been no discarded cup. And without the direct DNA confirmation, the investigation would have lacked the decisive connection needed for prosecution. Every stage mattered. That chain of events explains why cold cases sometimes remain alive even when they appear hopeless. The investigation may be dormant, but the evidence is not necessarily dead. A piece of biological material collected decades earlier can become more valuable as technology improves. A fingerprint, once too incomplete to identify, can potentially be re-examined. Digital records can be recovered. Databases can expand. New investigative methods can reveal connections that were invisible to earlier generations. The passage of time can therefore work in two directions. It can erase memories and destroy evidence, but it can also give science the opportunity to develop. In the case of Jay and Tanya, science ultimately won that race. The biological evidence survived long enough for investigators to use it. 36 years after their deaths, the unknown killer had been identified, arrested, and convicted. But even after the legal conclusion, one question remained suspended over the entire story. How many other cold cases were sitting in police archives with evidence that could someday speak? How many unidentified genetic profiles were waiting for the right database, the right algorithm, or the right scientific breakthrough? The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation suggested that some cases were not truly dead. They were simply waiting for the future. And somewhere inside the evidence from 1987, a message had been waiting all along. The killer had left something behind. Investigators had preserved it. Science eventually understood it. And when that silent biological trace was finally connected to a living man, 36 years of uncertainty began collapsing almost at once. For Jay and Tanya's families, the discovery could never erase what happened, but it could finally answer the question that had haunted them across decades. The man who had remained unknown since 1987 now had a name. The case had a suspect. The suspect had faced a jury, and the evidence that had survived the passage of time had finally been allowed to tell its story. The convictions brought a legal conclusion, but they did not erase the questions that had accumulated around the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg for more than 30 years. In fact, once the courtroom proceedings ended, another part of the story became impossible to ignore. How had investigators managed to find a killer who had remained unidentified for so long? And what did that breakthrough mean for the future of cold case investigation? The answer began with something that had been sitting quietly inside the evidence for decades. DNA, in 1987, investigators could collect biological material, preserve it, and attempt to analyze it. But the technology available at the time could not provide the kind of investigative pathway that existed in 2018. The biological evidence connected to the murders could eventually produce a genetic profile, but that profile initially belonged to nobody investigators could name. It was an anonymous signature. It could tell detectives that a particular biological source had been present, but it could not tell them who that person was. That limitation is what allowed the case to remain unsolved for so many years. The killer did not necessarily need to destroy every trace. He only needed to avoid leaving behind a trace that investigators could immediately connect to his identity. But science continued to evolve while the case remained open. DNA databases grew. Laboratory techniques became more sensitive. Genetic genealogy emerged, and investigators learned that an unknown person could sometimes be identified indirectly through the DNA of relatives. That possibility changed everything. The investigation eventually reached Parabon Nanolabs, whose forensic genetic genealogy work helped investigators transform the unidentified profile into a family connection. Instead of searching for the killer directly, investigators searched for genetic relatives. The result was not an immediate name. It was a family tree. From there, researchers began working through generations of relationships, identifying individuals who could potentially match the biological evidence and the circumstances surrounding the murder. William Earl Talbot emerged as the leading candidate. He had been 20 years old in 1987 and lived in the Washington area. The genealogical evidence suggested that he could be related to the unknown DNA profile. But investigators knew they needed something stronger than genealogy. They needed a direct comparison. So detectives followed Talbot and obtained a discarded cup after he drank from it. The cup contained biological material. Laboratory analysis compared that DNA with the profile associated with the crime. The result was the critical confirmation. The DNA matched. Suddenly, the 30-year-old investigation had a living suspect. The case had moved from genealogy to conventional forensic evidence. The family tree had pointed investigators toward Talbot, and the DNA comparison had confirmed the connection. That sequence became one of the most important aspects of the prosecution. It showed that genetic genealogy could function as an investigative tool, while the ultimate courtroom evidence could still come from a direct DNA comparison. The distinction mattered because the investigation was ultimately judged in court, where prosecutors had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA match was powerful, but prosecutors also had to present the broader circumstances of the murders and explain why the evidence pointed toward Talbot. The story returned repeatedly to the journey Jay and Tanya had taken in November 1987. They had traveled south from British Columbia, intending to make a short trip to Seattle. They were young and had no reason to believe that their journey would become fatal. Their van was eventually recovered in Bellingham. Tanya's body was discovered near Alger. Jay's body was later found near Monroe. Those locations formed a geographic trail that investigators had been trying to understand since the beginning. Every location raised questions. Why had the couple ended up there? How had they encountered their killer? How had the killer moved them or their belongings? And what sequence of events had taken place between their disappearance and the discovery of their bodies? Some of those questions could be answered through evidence. Others could only be approached through inference. The passage of time meant that no complete eyewitness account of the murders was available. The killer could not be questioned about his actions before the case reached court, and the victims could not tell investigators what had happened. That left the physical evidence carrying an enormous burden. The DNA became the central link between the unknown offender and Talbot. The investigation had essentially turned the killer's own biological trace against him. Yet the case was about more than forensic technology. It was also about persistence. The murders happened in an era when investigators did not have the tools that would later become available. But the original evidence was preserved. That decision mattered. If investigators had treated the case as hopeless and failed to preserve biological evidence, the future breakthrough would have been impossible. Instead, the evidence survived the passage of time. 30 years later, investigators could return to it with new technology. This is one of the defining characteristics of a true cold case. The original investigation may reach a dead end, but the evidence remains capable of generating new leads. A cold case is not necessarily a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case with evidence that cannot yet be interpreted. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation became a dramatic example of that distinction. The DNA was not newly created in 2018. It had been connected to the crime since 1987. What changed was the ability to identify the person behind it. The forensic genetic genealogy process also changed the nature of the investigation. Traditional police work often begins with people, places, and known relationships. Genetic genealogy begins with biological relationships. It asks not only who could have committed the crime, but who shares enough genetic material with the unknown source to reveal a family connection. That approach can bypass conventional investigative barriers. A suspect who never appeared in police records can potentially be identified through relatives. That was what made the technique so powerful and also so controversial. It expanded the reach of law enforcement into information that had traditionally been associated with private family research. People using genealogy services may submit DNA because they want to learn about their ancestry, discover relatives, or understand their family history. They may not realize that the same information can help investigators identify someone who shares their genetic background. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg case therefore became part of a larger discussion about the balance between privacy and public safety, but before those debates became widespread, the immediate question was whether the technique could deliver justice. In this case, it did. Talbot was arrested. Prosecutors built their case. The first trial focused on Tanya's murder. The jury found him guilty. The second trial addressed J.S.'s death. Again, the evidence was presented, challenged, and evaluated. The jury ultimately returned another guilty verdict. After more than 30 years, the legal system had established responsibility for both murders. For investigators, the result represented the culmination of years of work. For the families, it represented something far more personal. They had spent decades without knowing who had killed the two young people they loved. They had lived through anniversaries, birthdays, and family milestones, knowing that Jay and Tanya would never experience them. They had watched the investigation move from active searches to a cold case status. They had seen technology change around them while the central mystery remained frozen in 1987. Then suddenly, in 2018, the case was moving again. A genetic connection appeared. A suspect was identified. A discarded cup produced the confirmation, and the person responsible was finally brought into court. The emotional impact of that sequence is difficult to measure. An arrest can create relief, but it can also produce anger. Families may wonder how the killer managed to remain unidentified for so long. They may wonder whether earlier technology could have solved the case. They may wonder whether something was missed, and they may wonder what the killer was doing during all those years. The answers are not always available. In the Cook-Van Cuylenborg case, the most important answer was that the biological evidence had survived. It had remained available for future investigators. The case therefore became a powerful reminder that forensic evidence can have a life far longer than the investigation first collected it. Technology has an unusual relationship with time. The older a case becomes, the more obsolete its original investigative methods may appear. But the same passage of time can create new tools. DNA sequencing becomes more precise, databases become larger, computational methods become more sophisticated, genealogical research becomes more interconnected. A sample that produced almost nothing in 1987 can become decisive in 2018. That does not mean every cold case will be solved. Evidence can be degraded. Profiles can be incomplete. Genetic relatives may not exist in searchable databases. Investigators may still be unable to establish a sufficient connection, but the possibility changes the way unsolved cases are viewed. A file that once appeared permanently closed may contain a clue whose significance has not yet been discovered. That idea became inseparable from the story of Jay and Tanya. Their case had remained unsolved for decades, but the evidence had never stopped existing. The killer's genetic signature had remained buried inside the investigation. The breakthrough came when investigators found a way to connect that signature to a family. Then they found the person. Then they confirmed him through DNA. The process was not magic. It was science combined with investigative persistence. But to the families, the result must have felt almost impossible after so many years. One day, there was no name. Then there was a name. One day, the killer was an unknown figure. Then he was a defendant. One day, the case existed only in old files. Then it was back in court. The transformation happened because the past had been preserved well enough for the future to examine it. Yet even with the convictions, the case carried a permanent sadness. Jay and Tanya remained exactly as old as they had been when their lives were taken. The world around them had changed dramatically. Technology had transformed. New generations had grown up. Investigative methods had evolved, but the victims remained frozen in photographs from 1987. That is one of the cruelest realities of violent crime. The offender can age. Investigators can retire. Families can grow older. Evidence can become more sophisticated. But the victim's life ends at the moment of death. No verdict can change that. No DNA match can restore it. The convictions could provide accountability, but not restoration. And perhaps that is why the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg continues to resonate. It is not only a story about a killer being identified after 36 years, it is a story about evidence refusing to disappear. It is a story about families refusing to let two names become forgotten. It is a story about investigators who kept returning to a case that had resisted every conventional answer. And it is a story about technology changing the meaning of a tiny biological trace. In 1987, that trace was evidence without an identity. In 2018, it became a path to a suspect. The path began with an unknown DNA profile. It continued through distant genetic relatives. It moved through generations of family records. It narrowed toward one man. Then a discarded cup provided the final confirmation. The case that had seemed frozen for decades began moving again. First toward an arrest, and then toward a courtroom. The final verdicts could not explain every unanswered detail, but they changed the most important fact of all. The murders were no longer officially unsolved. The names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were no longer permanently attached to an unidentified killer. Their case had been cracked open by science, and the evidence that had waited silently since 1987 had finally done what no eyewitness, no confession, and no conventional database could accomplish. It had pointed investigators toward the man whose genetic signature had been hiding in the case for more than 3 decades. By the time the name William Earl Talbot became public, the case had already survived longer than most investigations ever did. 36 years had passed since Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg began the journey that ended with both of them dead, and the investigation had moved through an era of forensic science that seemed almost primitive compared with the tool eventually used to identify their killer. But the conviction did not simply close an old file. It exposed how dramatically the meaning of evidence can change with time. In 1987, investigators had a crime scene. They had physical evidence. They had 2 victims. They had a van and a series of locations scattered across Washington state. What they did not have was a name. That missing name became the central absence in the investigation for more than 3 decades. The biological evidence associated with the crime could eventually produce a DNA profile, but a profile without a reference remained an unidentified genetic signature. Investigators could compare it against available suspects, but if the true offender was not already represented in the relevant database, the search could stop there. That was the limitation facing detectives for years. The evidence existed, but the technology could not yet turn it into an identity. The breakthrough came when investigators began looking beyond conventional criminal databases. Forensic genetic genealogy allowed them to search for genetic relatives of the unknown individual. That meant the investigation could move through family connections rather than waiting for the killer himself to appear in a database. The process was painstaking. A distant relative might share only a small amount of DNA with the unknown source, and identifying the significance of that relationship required specialists who understood both genetics and genealogy. Investigators had to build family trees and determine which branches could contain a person who fit the circumstances of the 1987 murders. Eventually, the research narrowed toward William Earl Talbot. His age and location made him a plausible candidate. But investigators still needed direct confirmation. That confirmation came through the discarded cup, obtained after detectives followed Talbot. The DNA recovered from the cup matched the DNA profile associated with the crime. The match transformed the investigation. It was no longer a genealogical possibility. It was a direct forensic connection. Talbot was arrested in 2018. For the families, the arrest represented an event they had waited decades to see. But an arrest is not justice by itself. It is the beginning of a legal process. The prosecution still had to prove its case, and the defense still had the right to challenge every element of the evidence. The first trial focused on Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Her murder had been one of the most painful parts of the original investigation because she had been found alone, while Jay remained missing. Her body had been discovered near Alger on November 18th. Still, 1987, Jay's body was not found until December 10th. That gap between the discoveries had forced investigators to work with an incomplete picture. By the time Talbot was arrested, the prosecution could present the case with a level of forensic certainty that investigators in 1987 had never possessed. The DNA evidence connected Talbot to biological material from the crime. Genetic genealogy explained how investigators had reached him. The discarded cup provided the reference sample. Together, those elements formed a powerful chain. The defense challenged the evidence, but the jury ultimately found Talbot guilty of Tanya's murder. The verdict was historic. More than 3 decades after the crime, a jury had formally determined that Talbot was responsible for Tanya's death. Yet the story did not stop there because Jay had also been murdered. The second prosecution required investigators and prosecutors to establish the evidence connecting Talbot to Jay's death as well. The 2 killings were part of the same larger tragedy, but the justice system had to consider the evidence surrounding each victim. The second case brought the story back to Jay, a 20-year-old man whose life had been cut short during a trip that had begun as an ordinary business journey. Jay had traveled south with Tanya to Seattle. They expected to return home. Instead, both were killed. His body was discovered near Monroe weeks after Tanya's body had been found. The location added another layer of complexity to the investigation because detectives had to understand how the couple's movements connected the different crime scenes. The evidence from 1987 had to be interpreted alongside the modern DNA finding. Prosecutors presented their case, while the defense continued to challenge the state's conclusion. But the DNA evidence remained central. The same investigative breakthrough that had identified Talbot in connection with Tanya's murder now formed part of the prosecution concerning Jay. The jury ultimately found Talbot guilty of Jay's murder as well. With both convictions, the legal system had finally reached a conclusion that had seemed impossible for most of the previous 36 years. 2 murders, 2 convictions, 1 investigation transformed by genetic science. But there was another dimension to the case that became increasingly important after the verdicts: the extraordinary role played by genetic genealogy. The Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation was among the early high-profile cases in which this method demonstrated its ability to identify a suspect who had avoided traditional DNA databases. The technique showed that a criminal investigation could sometimes proceed from an unknown DNA profile to distant relatives, from relatives to a family tree, and from a family tree to an individual. The method did not replace traditional police work. It expanded it. Genealogical research produced the investigative lead. Conventional DNA testing then provided the direct confirmation. That distinction became crucial as forensic genealogy attracted national attention. People began asking how much genetic information law enforcement should be permitted to use. If someone uploads DNA to a genealogy service, can investigators use that information to identify a relative? What happens when a person who never agreed to participate in a criminal investigation becomes indirectly involved because of shared DNA? These were not theoretical questions anymore. The Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated that genetic relationships could reach far beyond the individual who originally submitted the data. A person's DNA contains information about relatives because genetics is shared across generations. That made genetic genealogy both powerful and complicated. But in 2018, the immediate result was clear. The technology had helped identify the man investigators believed responsible for a double murder that had remained unsolved since 1987. For the families, the debate about privacy could not overshadow the emotional significance of the convictions. They had lived through decades when there was no answer. They had experienced the pain of seeing the case remain unsolved while life continued around them. They had watched their loved ones remain forever young in photographs while everyone else grew older. The arrest and convictions changed the status of the case, but they could not change the past. Jay would still be 20. Tanya would still be 18. Their families would still carry the memories of who they were before the murder. The legal process could establish accountability, but it could not restore the lives that had been lost. That distinction is often difficult to understand from outside a victim's family. A headline may say "cold case solved." A news report may describe a DNA breakthrough. A courtroom may deliver a guilty verdict, but for the people who love the victims, solving the case does not necessarily feel like an ending. It can feel like the beginning of a different kind of grief. For years, uncertainty becomes part of daily life. The family learns to live without answers. Then suddenly the answers arrive, and the old wounds reopen. The name of the killer becomes known. The details of the investigation return to the news. The crime that had once been discussed only in private is suddenly public again, and the family must confront the reality that the person responsible had lived through decades while their loved ones could not. That was part of the emotional complexity surrounding the Cook Van Cuylenborg case. Talbot had not been identified in the immediate aftermath of the murders. He had not been arrested in the years that followed. He remained unidentified until investigators used a technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. The passage of time therefore became central to the story. 36 years separated the crime from the breakthrough. 36 years of technological development. 36 years of investigative persistence, 36 years during which the evidence remained preserved. The case demonstrated why investigators sometimes refuse to declare a case hopeless. The technology available today may not be the technology available tomorrow. A DNA profile that cannot be matched today may be matched years later. A database that contains no useful relatives may eventually contain several. A scientific technique that does not exist today may become routine in the future. The evidence can wait. The families cannot. That imbalance is what makes cold cases so painful. Investigators can revisit a file. Scientists can run a new test. Databases can be updated, but the families experience every passing year personal. Each birthday that should have belonged to Jay becomes another reminder that he never reached it. Each year that Tanya should have experienced becomes another reminder that her life ended at 8. The passage of time does not reduce the significance of the loss. It only increases the number of years that were stolen. The convictions therefore represented something more than punishment. They created an official record that Jay and Tanya had been wronged and that someone had been held responsible. They also demonstrated the value of preserving evidence from old cases. The biological material collected in 1987 became the foundation of an investigation that could not have been conducted in the same way when the murders occurred without that evidence. Genetic genealogy would have had nothing to search. Without the DNA profile, the family tree would never have been built. Without the genealogy, investigators might never have reached Talbot. Without the discarded cup, the genealogical lead might not have produced the direct confirmation necessary for prosecution. Each step depended on the one before it. The result was a chain stretching across 3 decades. It was a chain built from science, investigation, and time. But even after the chain reached the courtroom, one haunting fact remained. The investigation could establish who was responsible, but it could never fully reconstruct the emotional reality of Jay and Tanya's final hours. Their voices were gone. Their perspective was gone. The complete story could never be told by the 2 people who experienced it. That silence would remain permanent. And perhaps that is why the case continued to resonate even after the convictions. It was not simply a story about an old murder finally solved. It was a story about 2 young lives interrupted, 2 families waiting, investigators refusing to abandon the evidence, and a scientific breakthrough that reached backward across 36 years. The killer had once been hidden behind an unknown DNA profile. Then genealogy revealed the family. The family revealed the suspect. The suspect's discarded cup provided the match. The match led to an arrest. The arrest led to a trial. The trial led to convictions. A chain that began with a biological trace finally reached a courtroom. And yet, even after the final verdict, the oldest question remained the most difficult. Why did two young people leave home expecting an ordinary trip and never return? The answer could never be fully recovered. What could be established was that their killer had left evidence behind, and that evidence survived long enough for science to catch up with him. 36 years later, the silence was finally broken. By the time the second conviction had been delivered, the case of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had undergone an extraordinary transformation. What had once been an apparently unsolvable double murder had become a landmark example of how modern forensic science could reach backward across decades. But the deeper investigators looked into the case, the more obvious it became that the breakthrough had not happened because of one miraculous test. It had happened because evidence, technology, and persistence finally collided at exactly the right moment. In 1987, none of that future was visible. Jay and Tanya were simply two young people beginning a journey from British Columbia into Washington state. Their families had no reason to believe that anything extraordinary was about to happen. They expected the couple to return. Instead, the trip became the beginning of one of Washington's most enduring murder investigations. Their disappearance immediately created uncertainty. Where were they? Why had they stopped communicating? What had happened to their van? Those questions became increasingly urgent as the days passed. Then the discoveries began. Tanya's body was found near Alger on November 18th. Jay's body was found near Monroe on December 10th. The couple who had entered Washington together had now been found dead in different places, and investigators were forced to reconstruct a journey that had ended in violence. The van was recovered in Bellingham, adding another location to the growing map of the investigation. Every piece of geography mattered. Every movement had the potential to reveal a connection. But the person responsible remained unidentified. In the early stages of a homicide investigation, detectives depend heavily on witnesses, physical evidence, known relationships, and immediate leads. But as time passes, those sources can disappear. Witnesses move. Memories change. Records become harder to locate. People who were once questioned may no longer remember details. Investigators retire. Departments change. And eventually, a case can become a collection of old reports that only occasionally return to the attention of detectives. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg case avoided complete disappearance because the evidence remained. Among the most important pieces was biological material associated with the crime. As forensic DNA technology developed, investigators were able to obtain a profile from the evidence. But that profile did not immediately identify anyone. It was simply the genetic signature of an unknown individual. For years, that was where the trail ended. The DNA could tell investigators that the same biological source was associated with evidence from the crime, but there was no direct name attached to it. The profile was like a fingerprint without a database entry. Investigators knew what they were looking for, but they had no way to connect it to a specific person. Then forensic genetic genealogy emerged. The concept changed the investigative landscape because it allowed detectives to search for biological relatives rather than the suspect himself. A distant relative could provide the first clue. That relative could lead to a family. The family could lead to a branch. And the branch could eventually lead to an individual who fit the circumstances of the crime. The investigation into Jay and Tanya's murders became one of the cases in which this strategy produced a dramatic result. Investigators worked with genetic genealogists to analyze the unknown profile instead of asking, "Who is this man?" They began with a different question. Who is genetically related to him? The answer gradually emerged through genealogical research. Family connections were traced. Generations were examined. Potential candidates were narrowed. Eventually, William Earl Talbot emerged as the person investigators believed could be responsible. He had been 20 years old in 1987, lived in Washington, and fit the geographic and demographic circumstances investigators were examining. But suspicion was not enough. The genealogical evidence had to be confirmed through conventional forensic testing. Detectives followed Talbot and obtained a discarded cup after he had used it. The biological material on the cup provided a reference sample. When laboratory analysts compared Talbot's DNA with the profile associated with the original investigation, the result was the breakthrough detectives had spent decades waiting for. The DNA matched. An unknown profile now had a name. The arrest that followed in 2018 stunned people who had followed the case. For 30 years, the investigation had existed without a known offender. Suddenly, a man was being charged. The case was no longer an old mystery. It was a live prosecution. News coverage focused on the extraordinary forensic method that had made the identification possible. Genetic genealogy was still relatively new to the public, and the case helped demonstrate its power. Investigators had not found Talbot because he had voluntarily submitted his DNA to a police database. They had found him because his genetic relationships helped point toward his family. The discarded cup then provided the direct comparison. The combination was revolutionary, but the courtroom still had to determine what the evidence meant. The prosecution presented the DNA connection as a critical piece of the case. The defense challenged the state's evidence and arguments. Jurors had to consider the scientific testimony, the investigative process, and the circumstances surrounding the murders. The first trial resulted in a conviction for Tanya's murder. The second trial resulted in a conviction for J.S. murder. After the second verdict, the legal status of the case had fundamentally changed. The killings were no longer unresolved. The man identified through genetic genealogy had been convicted in court. But the case continued to generate discussion because of the unusual path from crime scene to courtroom. In a traditional homicide investigation, detectives might begin with a suspect and then collect DNA to confirm or eliminate that person. Here the direction was almost reversed. Investigators began with an unknown genetic profile. They searched for relatives. They built a family tree. They identified a possible suspect. Only then did they obtain a direct sample and perform the comparison. That sequence became a model for how cold case investigators use genealogy to approach unidentified offenders. It also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. The biological material had been collected decades earlier, long before investigators knew how valuable it might become. The evidence had survived long enough for new science to make it useful. Without preservation, the breakthrough would never have happened. That lesson extended far beyond this single case. Cold case investigators often work with evidence collected under older standards and with technologies that have since become obsolete. A sample that once seemed inconclusive may contain information that modern laboratories can recover. An old photograph can sometimes reveal details invisible to investigators decades earlier. A fingerprint can be re-examined with newer systems. Digital databases can create connections that were impossible before computers became central to police work. In the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation, DNA became the bridge between the past and the present. But there was another reason. The case remained emotionally powerful. The passage of time had not reduced the importance of the victims. Jay and Tanya were still remembered by their families. Their photographs remained. Their names remained. Their story remained. The world around them had changed, but their absence did not. The people who loved them had grown older while Jay and Tanya remained forever young. That is a reality shared by every long unsolved homicide. The victim's life stops, but the investigation can continue indefinitely. A case can pass from one generation of detectives to another. Files can be reopened. Evidence can be retested. New technology can be applied. And sometimes, decades after the original crime, a new investigator can find the clue that previous investigators could not. In this case, the clue was not newly created. It had been waiting all along. The genetic profile was already inside the case. What investigators lacked was the ability to connect it to a person. Genetic genealogy supplied that missing connection. The identification of Talbot also forced investigators and the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. A person suspected of a crime could remain unidentified for decades while living an ordinary life. The passage of time does not necessarily erase responsibility. It may simply delay discovery. That is why cold cases can carry such a powerful psychological weight. Families can never know whether the person responsible is watching the investigation from a distance, living nearby, or has disappeared entirely. Until an identity is established, every possibility remains open. The arrest in 2018 closed that uncertainty. There was finally a person to prosecute. There was finally a name attached to the unknown DNA, and there was finally a courtroom where the evidence could be examined. Yet, even after the convictions, the case did not become simple. The technology that solved it created new questions about privacy. Genetic genealogy relies on information shared across families. If one person uploads DNA for ancestry research, their genetic connections may reveal information about relatives who never participated. That reality forced law enforcement agencies, genetic companies, and the public to debate how far these investigations should go. Should police be allowed to use genealogy databases to investigate violent crimes? Under what circumstances? What safeguards should exist? How should innocent relatives be protected? These questions became increasingly urgent as more cold cases were solved through genetic genealogy. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg case stood near the beginning of that transformation. It showed what was possible. It also showed why the method required careful limits and verification. The genealogical lead alone was not the final answer. Investigators still needed direct DNA confirmation. The discarded cup supplied that confirmation. That distinction helped make the case so significant. The investigation demonstrated a pathway from unidentified DNA to a family tree, and from a family tree to a direct forensic match. It was a chain of evidence that began with the original crime scene and ended decades later with a named defendant. But beneath the science remained the same human story. Jay and Tanya were young. They had families. They had plans. They had lives that should have continued. Their journey south should have ended with a return home. Instead, it ended with two bodies, two grieving families, and a police investigation that would stretch across generations. The fact that the case was eventually solved did not make the years disappear. It did not give the families back the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments they had lost. It did not answer every question about the victim's final hour. What it did was establish responsibility. It gave the families the knowledge that the investigation had not failed forever. The evidence had survived. The detectives had persisted. The science had evolved. And eventually, the truth emerged from a place no investigator in 1987 could have imagined: a genetic relationship hidden inside a family tree. That was the extraordinary lesson of the case. The killer had not been defeated by a dramatic confession or a witness suddenly remembering a crucial detail. He had been identified because the biological evidence he left behind could not forget. Time passed. Investigators changed. Technology advanced. But the DNA remained. And when science finally learned how to interpret the genetic connections contained within it, the case began to unravel. The unknown became a family. The family became a suspect. The suspect became a DNA match. The DNA match became an arrest. The arrest became a trial. And the trial became a conviction. 36 years of uncertainty had collapsed into a sequence of forensic discoveries. Yet the final image of the case remained haunting. Two young people had entered Washington together in 1987. They never came home. For decades, their families had lived without knowing who had taken them. Then, after a lifetime of waiting, a technology that did not exist when they died reached into the past and found the answer. The killer had left evidence behind. He simply did not know that someday, decades later, science would be able to read it. The courtroom verdicts had finally given the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg a legal conclusion, but the story that had begun in 1987 still carried the weight of everything that had happened between the first police search and the final conviction. For more than 3 decades, the case had existed in an uncomfortable space between memory and uncertainty. There were victims, there was evidence, there was an unidentified offender, and there were families who had never stopped waiting for an answer. Then modern science changed the equation. The genetic profile that had once been little more than an anonymous biological signature became the key to a family tree, and that family tree eventually led investigators to William Earl Talbot. But the importance of the breakthrough could only be understood by returning to the original investigation, because every modern discovery depended on decisions made decades earlier. When Jay and Tanya disappeared in 1987, investigators had no idea that evidence collected during the investigation would someday become the foundation of a forensic genealogy case. They could not know that DNA technology would advance so rapidly. They could not predict that consumer genealogy databases would become widespread. They could not imagine investigators decades later tracing distant relatives through genetic connections. They simply collected what they could, documented the scenes, and attempted to understand what had happened. That ordinary investigative work became extraordinary only because the evidence survived. The passage of time had transformed the case. In 1987, the investigation was immediate and physical. Detectives searched for people who might have seen the victims. They examined locations. They recovered evidence. They tried to establish a timeline. They wanted to know where Jay and Tanya had gone after entering Washington and how their journey had ended in murder. But without an identified offender, the investigation faced an obstacle that would remain for years. There was no obvious suspect whose DNA could be tested. There was no direct confession. There was no simple explanation. The case gradually became one of those investigations that remained open but resistant to resolution. Yet the biological evidence preserved an invisible connection to the offender. That connection would eventually become the most important part of the case. As forensic science developed, investigators were able to generate a DNA profile associated with the crime. But a profile was only useful if it could be compared against something. When traditional searches failed to identify the person, the profile remained an unknown. It was as though investigators possessed a key but had no idea which door it opened. The emergence of forensic genetic genealogy changed that. Instead of searching only for the individual who had left the DNA, investigators could search for relatives who shared enough genetic information to reveal a family connection. The concept was revolutionary because genetic relationships exist even when people have never met. A person can be completely unknown to investigators and still have cousins, distant relatives, or other family members whose DNA creates a path back to them. That path was followed in the Cook-Van Cuylenborg case. Researchers examined the genetic information and began building a family tree. The process narrowed the field until William Earl Talbot became a leading candidate. But even then, investigators did not treat the genealogy result as the final answer. They needed confirmation. The direct DNA sample obtained from Talbot became the decisive step. Detectives collected a discarded cup after following him. Laboratory testing compared the DNA from the cup with the DNA profile associated with the original case. The match was the moment the investigation had been waiting for. The unknown biological source now had an identity. The arrest followed in 2018. Suddenly, the case was no longer confined to archives and memory. It was moving through the modern criminal justice system. The prosecution then had to explain a crime that had happened 31 years earlier and present evidence that remained understandable and convincing to a jury. That challenge was enormous. Jurors had to mentally travel back to a world before smartphones, before social media, before modern consumer DNA testing, and before genetic genealogy had become a recognized investigative tool. They had to examine evidence collected in a completely different era and determine whether it established Talbot's guilt. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the DNA evidence and the circumstances connecting Talbot to the murders. The defense challenged the state's interpretation, but the scientific evidence remained central. The first trial resulted in a conviction for Tanya's murder. The second trial focused on Jay. Again, the jury heard evidence connecting Talbot to the crime. Again, the defense challenged the prosecution's case. And again, the jury returned a guilty verdict. The result was extraordinary. The same case that had been unsolved for 36 years had now produced conviction. Yet the passage of time raised another question. Why had the killer remained unidentified for so long? The answer was not necessarily that investigators had ignored obvious evidence. The problem was that the technology needed to interpret the evidence simply did not exist. This is one of the most important lessons of cold case investigation. Sometimes the evidence does not change. The science changes. A biological sample can sit in an evidence room for decades while researchers develop methods capable of extracting information that earlier investigators could not. The sample may appear silent, but it is not necessarily useless. It may simply be waiting for a future that has not arrived. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg case became a dramatic illustration of that principle. The DNA had been connected to the crime since 1987. Its investigative value increased as technology improved. By 2018, investigators could use genetic genealogy to turn the unknown profile into a family connection once. Talbot became a suspect. The direct DNA comparison provided the critical confirmation. The process was extraordinary, but it was also methodical. There was no single magical moment in which a computer suddenly produced the killer's name. There were stages: genetic analysis, genealogical research, family tree construction, investigative surveillance, recovery of a discarded object, laboratory comparison, arrest, prosecution, conviction, each step built upon the one before it. The case therefore became a powerful example of how modern cold case investigations can combine disciplines that did not traditionally operate together. Genetics, genealogy, traditional detective work, and courtroom procedure became part of the same chain. But the breakthrough also created controversy because the same technology that solved murders raised concerns about genetic privacy. When people upload DNA to genealogy services, they are often searching for family history. They may not expect their genetic information to help identify a relative in a criminal investigation. Yet that possibility became real. Investigators could use genetic relationships to work backward through family networks. The person who eventually became a suspect might never have submitted DNA himself. His relatives could provide the connection indirectly. This raised difficult questions about consent and privacy. The debate continues because the technology creates both enormous benefits and significant concerns. Solving a violent crime can provide justice for victims and families, but the process also requires society to decide what kinds of genetic information can be used, by whom, and under what rule. The Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation became part of that discussion because its breakthrough was so striking. The case showed that a killer could remain outside conventional databases and still be identified through relatives. For families of cold case victims, that possibility was transformative. For investigators, it created a new avenue. For privacy advocates, it created a new warning. And for the public, it revealed just how much information can be contained in DNA. But the most important people in the story remained Jay and Tanya. Their names could easily become secondary once the science became the headline. Genetic genealogy solves 1987 murder. DNA breakthrough identifies suspect. Cold case finally cracked. Those headlines describe the investigation, but they do not describe the lives that were lost. Jay and Tanya were more than evidence. They were not simply the source of DNA profiles. They were young people whose families expected them to return home. Their deaths created an absence that lasted for decades. The investigation became famous because of the technology, but the reason it mattered was because 2 lives had been taken. Their families carried that loss through every year. The case remained unresolved. The arrest brought a new form of pain because it forced the families to confront the possibility that the person responsible had been living somewhere while they were growing old. The convictions provided accountability, but they could not reverse the passage of time. They could not give Jay and Tanya the years they lost. They could not restore the ordinary experiences that should have followed their trip. That is why the phrase cold case solved can sometimes sound deceptively simple. A solved case does not mean the damage has been solved. It means the identity of the offender has been established and the legal process has reached a conclusion. The emotional consequences can continue for a lifetime. In the Cook Van Cuylenborg case, the families had to live with that distinction. They received answers, but they also received the painful reality of those answers. The man identified through DNA was no longer a theoretical possibility. He was a real person who had been prosecuted and convicted. The investigation had finally given the family something they had lacked for decades: certainty about responsibility. Yet certainty could not erase grief. The case also left a lasting legacy for investigators. It demonstrated why old biological evidence should be preserved whenever possible. It demonstrated the value of revisiting cold cases when new technology becomes available. And it demonstrated the importance of combining traditional detective work with emerging forensic method. A case can appear dormant for decades and still contain evidence capable of producing a breakthrough. The challenge is knowing when science has reached the point where that evidence can be used differently. In 1987, investigators could not follow the genetic path that would eventually identify Talbot. In 2018, they could. The evidence did not become stronger because time passed. The tools became stronger. That distinction is essential. It means that a cold case is not always a case without answers. Sometimes it is a case whose answers cannot yet be extracted from the evidence. The future may contain the missing technique. That possibility was demonstrated with startling clarity in the Cook Van Cuylenborg investigation. 36 years after the murders, the unidentified DNA profile finally became a route to the person investigators believed responsible. A family tree emerged. A suspect emerged. A discarded cup confirmed the match, and the courtroom eventually delivered convictions. The case had traveled from an ordinary journey in 1987 to one of the most significant demonstrations of forensic genetic genealogy decades later, yet the final truth remained painfully simple. Jay and Tanya had expected to go home. They never did. Their families waited. Investigators waited. The evidence waited. And while the world changed around them, the DNA remained silent until science finally learned how to ask it the right question. When investigators did, the silence ended. The years after the convictions brought a different kind of attention to the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, because the case was no longer defined only by the horror of what happened in 1987. It had become a landmark in forensic investigation, a demonstration of how an unknown offender could remain unidentified for decades and then suddenly be exposed through a combination of genetic genealogy and traditional DNA testing. But beneath the headlines and scientific discussion remained the same human story. Jay and Tanya had left British Columbia together. They were young. Their families expected them to return. Instead, their journey ended in two separate crime scenes and a mystery that would consume investigators for 36 years. The passage of time did not weaken the importance of the evidence. In some ways, it increased it. Every year that passed made the biological material more valuable because it became the bridge between the original investigation and the technology of the future. When the case was first investigated, DNA science was in its infancy. Investigators could preserve biological evidence, but the sophisticated genetic databases and genealogy systems of the 21st century did not exist. The idea that a suspect could be identified through a distant relative's DNA would have seemed almost impossible. Yet, that is essentially what happened. The unknown DNA profile associated with the murders became the starting point for a genetic genealogy investigation. Researchers searched for relatives, traced family connections, and constructed a family tree. The investigation eventually narrowed toward William Earl Talbot. But the genealogical discovery alone did not end the investigation. Detectives still had to prove that Talbot's DNA matched the biological evidence from the crime. The discarded cup provided that opportunity. Investigators obtained the cup after following Talbot, and the DNA recovered from it matched the profile associated with the case. That result changed the status of the investigation immediately. The unknown offender now had an identity. Talbot was arrested in 2018, and the case moved from investigation to prosecution. The trials that followed forced the evidence to withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. Genetic experts explained the DNA. Investigators described the process that had led them to Talbot. Prosecutors presented the circumstances surrounding the murders. The defense challenged the state's interpretation of the evidence, and jurors were ultimately asked to decide whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The first conviction concerned Tanya's murder. The second concerned Jay. With both verdicts, the criminal justice system had finally reached a conclusion that investigators in 1987 could not have imagined. The case was solved not because a forgotten witness suddenly came forward, not because the killer confessed, and not because investigators found a hidden document containing his name. The breakthrough came from genetics. That fact made the case especially significant. Forensic genetic genealogy had already been used in other investigations, but the Cook Van Cuylenborg case became one of the most widely discussed examples of the technique's ability to solve a decades-old homicide. The method demonstrated a fundamental change in forensic thinking. Traditional DNA analysis often asks whether an unknown profile matches a known person. Genetic genealogy can ask a different question. Who in the world is related to this unknown profile? That question opens a much larger investigative field. A suspect can remain absent from criminal databases while his relatives appear in genealogical records. investigators can use those relationships to construct a family tree and narrow the possibilities. The process does not automatically identify the offender. It creates an investigative lead. That lead must then be independently confirmed. In Talbot's case, the direct DNA comparison provided that confirmation. The sequence became important because it demonstrated a model that could later be applied to other cold cases. First, preserve the evidence. Second, develop a reliable DNA profile. Third, search for genetic relatives where appropriate. Fourth, build a family tree. Fifth, identify a plausible suspect. Sixth, obtain a reference sample through lawful investigative means. Seventh, compare the DNA. And finally, build the criminal case using the full body of evidence. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation showed that cold case work can become a bridge between generations of science. The original detectives collected evidence using the tools available in 1987. Decades later, new investigators were able to reinterpret that evidence using technologies that had not yet been invented. The original case was not replaced by a modern investigation. It was extended by it. That distinction matters because cold cases are often misunderstood as investigations that simply stopped. In reality, many remain open. Evidence is stored. Files remain accessible. Investigators change. New techniques appear. Sometimes the case is reviewed because a new detective notices something that earlier investigators overlooked. Sometimes a new database creates a possible match. Sometimes forensic science changes so dramatically that evidence once considered useless becomes valuable. In this case, the biological evidence became the key. The case also demonstrated the emotional importance of persistence. For the families of Jay and Tanya, every year without an answer was another year of uncertainty. They did not have the luxury of treating the case as an old historical mystery. It remained personal. Every anniversary marked another year since the deaths. Every family gathering carried the absence of the two young people who should have been there. Every passing year reinforced the fact that Jay and Tanya would never grow older. The victims remained frozen at 18 and 20 while their families aged around them. The eventual arrest, therefore, had a complicated emotional impact. It brought relief because investigators had finally identified the person responsible. It brought renewed grief because the details of the murders returned to public attention. It brought anger because so many years had passed. And it brought a kind of finality that could be both comforting and painful. For decades, the families had wondered whether the killer would ever be found. Now they knew. The question had been answered, but the answer could not undo the loss. This is the paradox at the heart of many cold case breakthroughs. Solving the crime does not solve the grief, it solves the mystery. It establishes responsibility. It can produce justice, but it cannot restore the victim. It cannot return a life to the family. It cannot recover the years that disappeared while the investigation remained unresolved. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg case therefore became more than a forensic success story. It became a reminder of what cold cases actually mean to the people connected to them. A cold case is not cold to the family. The temperature of the investigation may drop, but the emotional wound remains. That wound can be reopened whenever a new lead appears. The arrest in 2018 reopened it dramatically. The trials brought the case into public view again. The convictions eventually established accountability, but the memories of Jay and Tanya remained the center of the family's experience. Their lives were not defined by the evidence used to identify their killer. They were defined by who they were before the murder. The forensic breakthrough was important precisely because it gave investigators a way to protect the memory of those lives from disappearing into an unsolved case file. It gave their deaths an official conclusion. It established that someone had been held accountable. It allowed the families to say that the case had finally reached an answer. Yet the scientific legacy of the investigation extended beyond the families. The case became part of a broader transformation in law enforcement. Genetic genealogy began attracting attention from agencies investigating unidentified remains, sexual assaults, and unsolved murder. Investigators realized that DNA profiles that had remained unmatched for years could potentially be revisited through genealogical databases. The possibilities were enormous, but so were the ethical questions. Genetic information is not like an ordinary fingerprint. A fingerprint identifies an individual. DNA contains information about family. It can reveal relationships, ancestry, and biological connections. When law enforcement searches for a suspect through genetic relatives, the investigation can affect people who have never been suspected of a crime. That reality created debate over how genetic genealogy should be regulated. Should investigators be allowed to search genealogy databases for any offense or only the most serious crimes? Should companies require users to explicitly consent to law enforcement searches? What safeguards should protect innocent relatives? These questions became increasingly important as the technology spread. The Cook Van Cuylenborg case was therefore both a triumph and a warning. It showed the extraordinary potential of modern science to solve crimes that once seemed permanently unsolvable. But it also demonstrated that new investigative power must be accompanied by careful rules. The technology can reveal connections that people never expected to expose. That power requires responsibility. Still, the most haunting aspect of the case was not the technology. It was the passage of time. 36 years separated the murders from the identification. Imagine the changes that occurred during those years. People who were children in 1987 became adults. Families changed. Technology transformed everyday life. Computers became essential. The internet became universal. Smartphones replaced payphones. Social media reshaped communication. DNA databases expanded. Genealogy became digital. And through all of it, the evidence from Jay and Tanya's case remained. The murders belonged to another era, but the biological trace survived into the future. That is why cold cases can feel almost supernatural. A clue can sit dormant for decades and then suddenly become decisive. Something that seemed meaningless can become the piece that breaks the entire case open. The evidence does not know how old it is. DNA does not care whether a crime happened yesterday or 30 years ago. If the biological material is preserved, it can potentially remain useful long after memories have faded. That is what happened here. The killer left evidence behind in 1987. Investigators preserved it. Decades later, scientists found a way to connect it to a living person. The past reached into the present. The result was an arrest, a trial, and conviction. But even after the legal conclusion, the case retained an unanswered emotional dimension. There were still details that could never be restored. There were moments only Jay and Tanya experienced. There were thoughts they had before they died that no investigator could recover. There were conversations that would never be repeated. There were plans that would never be completed. The law could determine responsibility, but it could never recreate those missing pieces. That is why the final meaning of the case cannot be reduced to a headline about DNA. The technology mattered because it served the victims. It mattered because it transformed uncertainty into accountability. It mattered because it gave investigators a path